Hey guys, picture this. You're dressed in your finest tunic, if tunics could rust, stink, and itch simultaneously, and standing in a drafty stone chapel that smells faintly of mildew, livestock, and existential dread. You've waited for this day your entire life, because nothing says romance like negotiating the exact number of sheep your new in-laws expect in your dowry, while trying not to collapse from hypothermia on the unheated flagstones. Meanwhile, somewhere in the rafters, a minstrel plays Greensleeves, so off-key the rats are packing their bags. That, my friends, is medieval wedding bliss. 10 glorious seconds of pure, unfiltered chaos. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Imagine backing up your livestock procession down a narrow cobblestone lane, dodging carts, peasants, and the occasional ambassador sent to broker peace by stealing your best chicken. The average medieval wedding began not with love-struck gazes or sentimental vows, but with a landowner's meeting in the great hall, where two families haggled over cattle, coins, and the faint hope that the bride wouldn't suffer another bout of plague before the honeymoon. Parents exchanged glare for glare, hoping the other side would blink, like an awkward game of medieval chicken, before one clan finally conceded to throw in an extra sow. After all, in the absence of wedding planners, livestock often doubled as bridesmaids. When the fateful day arrived, the bride, typically draped in layers upon layers of wool and fur to combat the winter freeze, would process towards the chapel under a canopy held aloft by 6 burly groomsmen who probably hadn't slept in 3 days. Tea heaters, electric blankets? Nah, just the reassuring sight of miniature torches and the distinct possibility of spontaneous combustion from poorly maintained feudal lamps. Meanwhile, the groom strutted behind on horseback as if to say, "Yes, this is my future wife, and yes, I have absolutely no idea what I just agreed to." Neither of them had a clue how to pronounce each other's name properly. Regional dialects made, every syllable a verbal minefield, but that was just part of the fun. Once inside the chapel's drafty gloom, the ceremony commenced with a priest who had been bribed with a goat and a promise of guest list privileges at next month's harvest festival. He muttered Latin blessings that sounded suspiciously like barroom chants, punctuated by the occasional curse when his quill ran out of ink. Guests leaned forward, squinting, trying to decipher whether the couple was being blessed or accused of starting the Black Death. Either way, hands were clasped, rings were exchanged, iron bands roughly hammered by the village blacksmith, who also made horseshoes, swords, and inadvisably large cauldrons, and a communal sigh of relief swept the attendees. The deal was sealed. And now, the pièce de résistance, the feast. Picture a long wooden table groaning under platters of questionable meat, boar, venison, even peacock, if the lord of the manor felt particularly showy that day, flanked by bowls of pottage so thick you could stand your spoon upright. Wine was dispensed from barrels lugged in from France, which meant it was either exquisite or deadly. The fine line was measured by how many guests were dancing on the table by dessert. The bride's cleverest bridesmaid would hand out honey cakes decorated with tiny figurines of saints, while the groomsmen performed a choreographed jig that ended with one unfortunate lad losing a boot in the bride's punch. Romance. Medieval style. But don't think for a second this was all jolly japes. With every goblet raised in celebration came the ever-looming dread of the consummation. No sex education pamphlets here, just whispered warnings of bedroom gymnastics, and the comforting knowledge that the local wet nurse would be standing by, ready to extinguish the flames of our newlyweds' ardor with buckets of cold water, just in case things got too heated. Privacy? A rare commodity. Curtains were nothing more than burlap sacks draped crudely around the bedstead, leaving the couple to grapple with both each other and the worst draft of their lives. If they survived the night without frostbite or fainting, they considered themselves blessed. Morning light revealed the true extent of medieval wedding hangovers. Guests awoke in hay-strewn barns, under tables, or clutching random livestock, as if the sheep had always been their soulmates. Breakfast featured something called gruel, thin, watery oats that tasted like despair, washed down with mead so sickly sweet you'd swear the bees had been replaced with sugar-addicted demons. The newlyweds, bleary-eyed but expected to smile for portrait wannabe scribes, pretended that exchanging vows was the pinnacle of human achievement, conveniently ignoring the throbbing headaches and the colonists of lice making their grand re-entrance. Yet amidst this carnival of discomfort, something magical happened. Communities bonded. A wedding was the one day all year when peasants, knights, and jesters mingled freely, provided the jesters hadn't been detained for making the baron's horses neigh in jigs. Bonds forged over spilled ale and stolen spoils of the feast lasted until the next harvest. In-laws negotiated trade routes, gossip spread faster than plague rumors, and occasionally real love blossomed between two grimy, frost-bitten souls. It was messy, it was chaotic, but it was also the closest thing medieval folk had to reality TV. By noon, the procession, now wobbling thanks to half the guests stumbling in intoxication, ambled toward the manor. Children chased the bride's train, trying to snip ribbons for souvenirs. Dogs barked at every corporal gesture. Old Aunt Mildred, who once met the Pope, lectured the groom on the proper way to address ecclesiastical authorities, an instruction Nulibe promptly ignored. The bride's mother discreetly nodded in approval of the livestock tally, already calculating the dowry's worth against next winter's bark ration. Every face told a story. Triumph, regret, the kind of regret that makes you vow never to attend a wedding again. Yet you'd show up anyway, because weddings were the social network of the Middle Ages. As dusk painted the sky the color of bruised plums, torchlight flickered across the courtyard, casting elongated shadows on the stone walls. Torchbearers, strategically placed to hide the smell of manure, formed a flickering tunnel through which the couple paraded, recipients of good wishes, half-hearted cheers, and the occasional thrown turnip. A traditional gesture meaning, may your marriage be as resilient as a root vegetable. The sense of occasion was palpable. The couple, exhausted but euphoric, clung to each other like survivors of a shared apocalypse. And in that moment, amid smoke, laughter, and the distant bleating of livestock, medieval matrimony revealed its greatest secret. Despite the hardships, it was a celebration of life's fragile, absurd beauty. So, there you have it, the first 1,000 years of matrimonial mayhem compressed into a delightful snippet of medieval romantic dysfunction. Don't go anywhere. Up next, we'll explore the honeymoon horrors and the delightful tradition of bride capture. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The moment you think the nightmare stops at the wedding feast, think again. Because now comes the honeymoon, medieval style. Strap in for part 2 of our guide to marital mayhem, a belly full of absurd rituals, questionable consummations, and the ever-popular bride capture tradition. First off, congratulations, you're officially married. Now, let's talk about the honeymoon suite, a dank little room above the stables, or sometimes the family butcher's shop if you're unlucky, where the walls sweat more than you will. The bed is likely a lump of straw tossed onto a wooden frame so narrow that losing an elbow means tumbling straight onto the floor. Curtains? Sure, if burlap counts. And those birdsong noises? That's just roosters practicing their battle cries at 3 a.m. Every twig snapping outside is a potential rat raid on whatever remains of your bedding. Before you even consider consummation, there's the mildly comforting intervention of the midwife or wet nurse, whose job is to ensure the physical joining occurs. She arrives with a bucket of cold spring water to dunk your feet, which doubles as a test. If you don't shriek loudly enough, she's allowed to leave you alone for the next hour. Then comes the sanctifying bath, 2 wooden tubs of tepid water, infused with herbs so potent that you emerge smelling like a medieval perfume commercial gone wrong. If you're the bride, you'll pray your hair doesn't tangle into the bathtub's drain rope. If you're the groom, you'll silently mourn every strand of body hair the scrub woman accidentally pulls out. Once scrubbed, though many couples skip this entirely, poisonous insects having had their fill of your blood, you're herded into the bridal chamber. Here, the real fun begins. A handful of nosy relatives lurk outside the door, armed with torches to verify the deed took place. They shout awkward encouragements, louder, firmer, and occasionally offer strategic advice. Move your right arm to the left, dear boy. As if a medieval hunchback could perform modern yoga moves on straw. Privacy is a luxury for rich nobles who can afford curtains. For everyone else, soundproofing is a myth. The actual act? Imagine 2 people who've just met, wearing itchy linen shifts, with zero bedside manner, fumbling in the dark while praying neither one collapses from exhaustion. a slapstick routine worthy of the church jesters. And yet, failure carries severe social stigma, so husbands must prove their virility by procuring children immediately, often mounting the ailing bride from behind like a particularly unbalanced draft animal. No wonder the midwife sometimes needed to strap the couple together with leather thongs to keep them from rolling off the bed. After the achievement is verified, usually by blood-stained sheets or the flustered squeal of the bride, the cockpit transforms into a mess hall for the thirsty relatives. They pour ale through cracks in the door, insisting the bride and groom celebrate before the inquisition of how many heirs begins. The couple, half dead and half delirious, must feign enthusiasm, clutching mugs of lukewarm beer that tastes like saddles gone to seed. Morning brings neither relief nor romance. Instead, it greets you with the olfactory terror of the stable below and the uncomfortable snoring of your new spouse. The midwife returns at dawn to check on the wife's delicate constitution, poking at abdomen and ankles to see if anything has ruptured. You nod politely, praying she won't notice you've lost all feeling in your lower back from sleeping on straw. Next on the agenda, post-nuptial negotiations. This is where the groom's family demands their promised lands, money, or livestock. Negotiations can last hours and often break down into shouting matches reminiscent of the pre-wedding dowry haggling. The bride, still recovering from her first night, sits nearby clutching a cup of medicinal mead, which tastes of honey and regret. Now, let's delve into bride capture, a theatrical tradition many rural families use to prove the groom's passion. It involved the groom sneaking into the bride's home at night, stealing her from her own bed and sprinting back to his manor before anyone woke up. In practice, it looked more like a slow-motion chase, the bride wrapped in her mother's worst wool shawl, tripping over exposed floorboards, shrieking for her lover to stop gawking and run faster. The bride's brothers, awakened by the commotion, would pursue with torches and cudgels, shouting, "Bring back our dowry," because animal husbandry is apparently a family matter you can't let go lightly. Should the groom succeed, he'd deposit his captive in the bridal chamber under triumphant fanfare. Should he fail, by dropping her slipper in the dust or being waylaid by his in-laws for a quick ale, the couple would have to negotiate a ransom of sorts. The ransom might be more livestock, a promise of labor in the fields, or the groom's humiliation broadcast at the next church sermon. Romance indeed. Meanwhile, the guests, now gathered at the groom's manor, engaged in post-wedding pastimes like the ring toss, where the newlyweds flung their wedding ring into a barrel of cold water and scrambled to fish it out with bare hands. It was less an Olympic sport than a shaky dance on a splintered barrel, resulting in more than one shredded palm and at least 2 brawls when drunk uncles accused each other of foul play. On the third day, the real honeymoon began. A short procession to the bride's new home within the groom's domain, often miles of miserable dirt roads lined with inquisitive villagers. Think today's airport security line multiplied by rats, every child and dog lunging for souvenir scraps. The bride sat atop the family's finest horse, an animal so barbed by saddle sores that the bride had little sympathy for her new spouse's aches. Arriving at the manor, they were greeted by the lady of the house, who handed the bride a broom and spin wheel as welcome gifts. These symbolic items were not, as modern romantics imagine, tokens of domestic bliss, but rather obligatory reminders that a wife's true calling was to churn butter, spin yarn, and scrupulously mend all tunics until kingdom come. Bridal gifts of jewelry were rare. More common were sacks of grain or a freezer full of salted fish for the lively communal stew. The next week was a parade of visits, the local priest dropping by to bless the marriage and check the bride's virtue, the blacksmith offering discounted horseshoes as wedding presents, the neighbors each expecting a slice of cake, pounded wheat, mixed with honey and dried fruit so hard it could crack teeth. Debt collectors also made guest appearances, just checking you've paid your tithes and fines, turning what should have been a romantic retreat into a slip and slide of bookkeeping nightmares. Meanwhile, the bride adjusted to her new status, mastering the cathedral-worthy art of roasting a capon over an open hearth without burning her hair, managing the household's meager budget, and keeping the cat out of the pantry. The groom, ambitious and clueless, set out to prove himself through jousts or hunts, often returning with broken limbs or empty-handed, but never empty of self-importance. And of course, children. Only a true medieval spouse could appreciate the joy of pregnancy. Morning sickness that lasted all day, bizarre food cravings for stale ale, and the terrifying midwife's pronouncements of "it's a boy" or "it's twins," which translated to good luck, feeding them. The bride's next major event after childbirth was the church ceremony, known as the churching of women, whereby the mother was publicly declared pure again, allowing her to resume daily drudgeries like milking goats and weeding the vegetable patch. Through it all, the couple learned to lean on each other, mainly because no one else would show up without expecting something in return. When the barn burned down, they rebuilt it themselves. When the rain flooded the fields, they waded through water knee-deep to inspect the vines. Every shared hardship knit them closer, forging a bond tougher than the iron rings on their wedding fingers. By the end of that first year, they could look back on their wedding not as a triumph of love, but as a rite of passage into blind partnership with all its glorious absurdity. They'd survive rat infestations, rogue sausage carts, and drunken revelers who thought it hilarious to reenact the ring toss in the latrine. They'd survive because, in the medieval nightmare, survival itself was the greatest gift. So there you have it, Part 2's deep dive into the hot mess that was the medieval honeymoon. Stick around for Part 3, where we'll cheerily dissect medieval marriage counseling. Yes, that's a thing. And the ever-delightful challenge of organizing the next generation's betrothals. You won't believe the bedtime stories they told their children. Part 3, navigating the bureaucracy of marriage counseling and arranging the next generation's matches. So you thought surviving the wedding, honeymoon, dowry negotiations, and post-nuptial ransom demands was the climax? Think again. Welcome to the thrilling world of medieval marriage counseling, if you can call it that, and the never-ending cycle of betrothals. Strap in for the third installment of your crash course in matrimony mayhem. First up, marriage counseling. Unlike today's couples retreats in the Bahamas, medieval counseling typically involved your neighbors, the local priest, and, if you were unlucky, a traveling physician who doubled as a barber surgeon. If your marriage hit a rough patch, e.g. the groom spent the harvest season hunting instead of hauling grain, or the bride accidentally burned down the bakehouse, you had two main options: endure public shaming or petition the manorial court. At the manorial court, your grievances were shouted in archaic dialects over the clang of the reeve's ledger, and each spouse presented evidence, usually in the form of charcoal drawings of burnt ovens or sworn testimony from the village idiot. The reeve, perched on a hay bale, handed out sentences like mandatory beard trimming for the husband to humble his pride, or a week of charity work at the leper colony for the wife to encourage humility. Counseling session over. Nothing says "I love you" like forced chaplain-led scrubbing of diseased beggars. Meanwhile, the local priest offered spiritual guidance. Sessions consisted of kneeling on stone floors for hours, reciting penitential psalms, while praying your knees didn't give out, exposing your undershorts to the congregation. Confession involved admitting to sins like failing to provide adequate harvest offerings or drinking too much small beer during Lent. Afterward, the couple held hands and received absolution, just in time for the next crisis, your first child. Ah yes, fertility. Bear in mind that medieval couples were under immense pressure to produce heirs, children who could haul wood, milk goats, or carry your banner into battle. If pregnancy didn't occur by the third year, you were sent to a so-called fertility charm specialist, a herbalist conjuring potions of boiled nettles and toad's eye berries, guaranteed to awaken the womb. The wife drank it like bitter porridge, then spent 3 days in a sweat lodge, improvised from sheepskins and hot stones. Did it work? Opinions varied. At best, you ended up with violent indigestion and a newfound empathy for famine victims. Should real medical intervention be necessary, the couple endured a visit from the barber surgeon, who wielded not modern instruments but rusty scalpels and leeches. He squeezed your groin with a pair of iron pincers to stimulate seed, drew noxious fluids from your arm to balance humors, and tucked 5 leeches into your nether regions for luck. Survivors bragged about their scars, while casualties were quietly buried beneath the pigsty. Fertility rates improved, provided you lived through the treatment. Pregnancy at last. For the next 9 months, the bride endured the maternity confinement, a period of isolation supervised by the midwife and a rotating cast of gossiping matrons. She sat on a wooden birth stool, chomping bread dipped in watered-down wine because spices were too expensive. Exercise consisted of knitting yarn for the baby's swaddling bands, each loop a prayer that both mother and babe made it to month 10. Meanwhile, the husband practiced parenting by carrying buckets of manure to fertilize the fields, convinced that his own scent would strengthen the child's constitution. The big day arrived with all the fanfare of a siege. The midwife called upon the family to guard the door. Less curious townsfolk gawp at the spectacle. When contractions peaked, she chanted in firm Latin incantations to guide the soul, while the relatives exchanged bets on gender and whether the infant would inherit grandma's wart. When the baby finally emerged, usually with a piercing wail that echoed through the rafters, everyone rejoiced, then promptly quarreled over who would care for the child so the mother could resume spinning. Congratulations, but hold your mead. You're not done yet. For medieval aristocrats, the next generation's betrothal negotiations began almost at birth. A baby's value hinged on strategic alliances. 5 years before the cradle cooled, noble families dispatched envoys to haggle over land rights, military pacts, and whether the infant would be raised in his or her maternal or paternal castle. Parents argued over which tutor would oversee Latin lessons, the one known for kindness or the one rumored to brandish canes on a whim. Every syllable was weighed against the kingdom's fluctuating balance of power, all while the newborn spit up on expensive tapestries. Peasant betrothals were simpler, if by simpler you mean even more absurd. At age 7, a peasant child underwent a mock wedding ceremony, complete with wooden rings and a chorus of church bells borrowed from the blacksmith. By age 10, they were legally bound to each other. She pledged her spinning wheel, he his plow. Official divorce? Practically impossible. If the intended spouse proved unfit, say the boy took a vow of silence or the girl was prone to fits of giggling, the families called upon the local reeve to annul the contract. The reeve consulted his ledger and, after much deliberation, slapped both families with fines for wasted parchment fees. Let's talk dowry disputes of the next gen. Just as you settled your own, now you must negotiate your child's dowry. Sacks of grain, a herd of goats, and perhaps a miniature orchard. But timing is everything. Too generous, and the groom's family suspects your family's coffers have hidden treasures. Too stingy, and the bride's prospects collapse faster than a leaky thatch roof. If you strike the wrong bargain, your daughter might end up with a peasant laborer who can't pay his tithes. Your son might marry a foreign heiress whose relatives demand perpetual caravans of silk and spices. And then there's the joy of divorce, strictly regulated by the church, of course. Grounds included infidelity, proved by 3 witnesses, witchcraft, rare but sensational, or non-consummation, if the groom still had the shreds of a wedding shift. Divorcees were shunned. The husband confined to a cell in the castle, keep until he agreed to terms. The wife returned to her father's home, shorn of her hair and her honor, wearing a gray shift for the next year. If children were involved, the manorial court assigned custody to whichever parent could prove the better cooking skills. Through it all, you learned that marriages were never static. They were living contracts subject to renegotiation, arbitration, and occasional acts of medieval pettiness. A stray rumor of infidelity, a poor harvest, or an unfortunate shipment of spoiled wine could reignite old disputes, sending you back to the same priest who married you in the first place. His salary? A loaf of bread and the promise of a free seat at the next harvest festival. But amid this endless loop of negotiation, counseling, and occasional violence, something beautiful flickers. Shared purpose. You and your spouse become allies in the grandest of quests, keeping the roof from leaking, the fires from dying, and the plague from sweeping your family away. When your neighbor's barn burns down at midnight, you load your cart with shovels and pitchforks. When the blacksmith's daughter falls sick, your wife kneads dough for healing biscuits. That's medieval romance. Not candlelit dinners, but candlelit survival side by side. So there you have it, part 3 of our sardonic safari through marital medievalism. Next time, join us for part 4, where we'll tackle widowhood rituals, remarriage shenanigans, and the unusual perks of being single, and a bit dangerous in the Middle Ages. Don't stray too far. Now, let's plunge into the aftermath of medieval matrimony, widowhood rituals, remarriage shenanigans, and the unexpected perks of single life when you're neither saint nor suspect, but definitely dangerous. When the groom or the bride suddenly checked out of this mortal coil, Medieval society treated widowhood not as a period of quiet mourning, but as a grand public performance. The widow was expected to don a widow's cap, a linen contraption so stiff it doubled as a helmet against nosy suitors, and a black gown dyed with gallnuts that smelled of vinegar and penitence. Mourning lasted anywhere from 6 months for peasants, because economic necessity trumped sentiment, to years for aristocrats who measured grief by the number of funerary masses they could afford. During this designated period, the widow's social calendar consisted of 3 daily obligations: morning prayers for her departed spouse's soul, midday fasting to demonstrate her piety, and evening inveighing against any suitor daring to glance her way. If a man so much as tipped his hat in her direction, her household maidens would launch into public scandal, spreading rumors as efficiently as plague spores. The local priest would be summoned to lecture on the sin of distracting the grieving, while the bailiff discreetly seized any land deals she attempted to broker. Yet behind the scenes, sharp-witted widows discovered that mourning rituals presented opportunities. With her husband gone, a widow often inherited his lands, livestock, and debts, welcome or otherwise. If her late spouse had been a ruthless landlord, tenants might rejoice at the prospect of more lenient rents. If the manor's roof leaked, she could hire cheap laborers or let the barn collapse entirely, pocketing the per cubic foot demolition fees. Some widows even staged exaggerated mourning to delay reprisal from creditors, all while quietly restoring the estate with proceeds from dowry gems sold off in secret auctions. For those in the upper echelons, widowhood was as much a political tool as a funeral rite. Noble widows like Eleanor of Aquitaine before her wielded significant influence, serving as regents for underage heirs, negotiating treaties, or organizing crusading contingents. Their mourning garments became symbols of authority, their capes draped over council tables. They got to set agendas, preside over courts, and banish incompetent stewards, all under the guise of honoring my late lord's legacy. If that legacy included a war chest, well, so much the better for funding personal power plays. But for the average widowed peasant, the path was less glamorous. She faced the specter of the parish poorhouse, or, worse, the local landowners swooping in to claim her hearth in lieu of unpaid debts. Widow courts, convened by the manor lord, determined whether she kept her cottage or got evicted. She might be forced to perform widow's service, an all-night vigil in the chapel, polishing pews until dawn, as penance for easily marrying beneath her station. Poor things. Then came remarriage. Medieval remarriage was less a matter of the heart and more a ledger balanced on knees. Widowers, desperate for heirs and domestic order, cast about for a new wife almost immediately, sometimes before the corpse was cold. They advertised for eligible widows in alphabetical parish directories, actually crudely painted boards outside the church, touting virtue and dowry welcome. A shrewd widow could leverage her lateness in life for favorable terms. "I'll marry you, on one condition: you must grant me full control of the granary, plus annual wool allotments." Ceremonially, remarriage borrowed elements from both weddings and funerals. The bride would wear half black, half colorful attire, a black bodice above the waist to honor the dead, a bright skirt below to signify hope. The ceremony itself might occur on the church's north side, the side associated with death, then conclude in the nave, associated with life. Guests were required to bring both mournful black bread, rye loaves baked without salt, and celebratory honey cakes. The feast then spiraled into a bizarre hybrid, mournful dirges on the lute segueing into drunken dances. But if the new bride or groom wanted to avoid the awkward funeral wedding mashup entirely, they could choose abatement, the practice of quietly affirming vows by candlelight in the family chapel, with only a handful of witnesses. No livestock parades, no communal feasting, just a hushed promise and a handshake on parchment. This option appealed to those who'd grown skeptical of communal spectacles after being pelted with turnips at their first wedding. Abatement marriages were legally valid but carried social stigma. Neighbors whispered about half marriages, and children born of the union were sometimes labeled shady heirs. Meanwhile, some widows resisted remarriage altogether, embracing singlehood with low-key rebellion. Unbound by marital obligations, they carved niches as medical midwives, herbalists, or apothecaries, roles often demonized by the church, but indispensable to rural healthcare. They set up unlicensed health huts on village outskirts, selling salves brewed from hemlock and elderberry. They tended plague victims, sidestepping official quarantines and earning grudging respect and occasional accusations of witchcraft. Indeed, medieval single women over 40 were prime targets for witch trials, but those accused often had the best survival skills. A network of loyal clients, secret medicine recipes, and an uncanny ability to vanish when inquisitors knocked. The perks of single life extended beyond professional autonomy. Legally, unmarried women could own property, draft contracts, and represent themselves in court, privileges forfeited upon marriage. A savvy spinster could accumulate land parcels through shrewd purchases. She'd advertise for social errands in exchange for grain quotas, then sneak off to acquire forsaken farm lots. By selling these lots back when estates needed quick cash, she built substantial wealth, all while her married counterparts were busy fetching water and churning butter. Don't imagine medieval singlehood was all business, though. When the village fair arrived each year, complete with bear baiting, archery contests, and a questionable midway, single knights and merchants eyed wealthy spinsters as marriage prospects. Some unmarried women took to attending fairs in elaborate disguises, veils, cloaks, even horsehair masks, to mingle without prejudgment. No groom's family could object to a bride whose face they'd never seen until after the vows. The resulting marriages were gambles. She might reveal herself as a celebrated beauty or a septuagenarian with gout. Risky, but thrilling. There was also the underappreciated tradition of the gossip cluster, an informal social network of widows and spinsters who met on market days under the old oak tree. They swapped news of miscarriages, baronial corruption, and the latest recipe for black pepper bread. They conspired to outwit predatory debt collectors by funneling payments through a rotating pool of disguised disguises. They even organized clandestine reading circles. If a priest looked their way, they pretended to cough violently. Through these alliances, single women carved out a parallel economy, exchanging goods, favors, and occasionally forged documents. But let's rewind to those dramatic widow wealth transfers. In some regions, widow inheritance laws, called dower rights, guaranteed a third of her husband's estate for her lifetime use. That was cold comfort to young widows with infant heirs. She'd spend years administering barns, negotiating tithes, and fending off rapacious uncles who wanted her land as collateral. Yet, some widows mastered the art of the dower joust, bringing lawsuits against unscrupulous male relatives to reclaim property. Court dockets filled with entries like Marjorie de Sutton versus Sir Aldred, claim of foul-laden barn and 3 sheep pens. She won half the time, cementing her reputation as that shrewd widow with the iron quill. Remarriage among peasants had its own quirks. After a husband died, a widow might be courted by multiple suitors, all eager to help with fieldwork and build a new family without a hefty dowry. But she held the power. Any suitor had to bring 3 gifts, a basket of ale, a pair of gloves, and a signed bond promising not to accuse her of witchcraft for at least 1 year. Suitors who refused to bind themselves in writing were politely escorted off the premises by her stoutly built farmhands. It was less romantic than a love letter, but infinitely more practical. Once a suitable match was found, the new wedding followed a streamlined peasant formula. A modest church ceremony on a weekday to avoid extra tithes, a home-cooked meal of salted pork and green peas, and a dance around the maypole, borrowed from spring planting rituals because it was already in storage. Guests brought jars of homemade cheese, and the bride's best friend organized a ring-giving game. Each guest tossed a ring into a cauldron of ale, and whoever succeeded won the bride's old widow's cap as a token of her acceptance. The new gown might be stitched from leftover fabric, but it was worn with pride, this time paired with practical leather boots rather than impractical high-nosed shoes that turned ankles. Now, let's consider the most unconventional perk of medieval single life, the dangerous freedom to travel. Few routes were as perilous as pilgrimages to holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury. Married women rarely undertook such ventures without male escorts, but widows and spinsters often joined pilgrimage groups, drawn by the promise of absolution and the thrill of adventure. They crossed mountains, bribed toll collectors, and endured seasick spells on overcrowded ships. They collected badges stamped with proof of pilgrimage, tiny lead tokens shaped like scallop shells, and sold them back at high prices to aristocrats seeking to display piety without the hassle of travel. In return, these intrepid single women brought back exotic relics, fragments of saints' bones, vials of holy water, and embroidered cloth rumored to contain Christ's sweat. They traded these treasures for spices, textiles, or letters of introduction to foreign courts. A single woman with a reputation for safe passage could become a valued courier for secreting messages across hostile borders, sometimes carrying diplomatic dispatches that influenced alliances. No husband could demand control over her secret routes. Her loyalty belonged to the highest bidder. Yet singlehood wasn't without its heartbreaks. Laymen called them maidenly melancholy, a condition marked by sudden fits of tears, vague longings for a gallant knight, and the inexplicable desire to rewatch every performance of the Castle of Otranto. Local physicians recommended ladies' baths, infused with rose petals and heavy readings of troubadour songs as cures. But true solace came from the gossip clusters and clandestine reading circles, the only places where a single woman's tears were met with empathy rather than patronizing pats on the wrist. And so, in the end, medieval life offered women 3 paths after their first marriage: the tedium of remarriage under new vows, the political power of widowhood with its attendant risks, or the precarious independence of singlehood, each with its own web of grammatical contracts, ritual garments, and social gambits. Every path was fraught with drafty halls, leaky roof tiles, and the smell of unwashed humanity, but peppered with moments of agency and sly triumph. A widow might triumph in a dower joust, a spinster might foil a tax collector, a newly remarried woman might secure peace between warring fiefdoms by lending her husband a sharp, strategic mind honed during her widow's service. Thus concludes our 4-part tour of medieval marital mayhem, from livestock-fueled weddings to rat-infested honeymoons, from haggled dowries to betrothal bureaus, and finally to the rites of widowhood, remarriage, and the audacity of the unwed. We've uncovered that, for all its misery and abundant mosquitoes, the Middle Ages were not devoid of humor, subversion, and unexpected empowerment. Because if there's one thing history tells us, it's that even in the darkest, most odoriferous corners of the past, human resilience and absurdity shone through. Thanks for surviving this saga with me. May your tunics be less itchy, your chambers less drafty, and your social contracts mercifully straightforward. And remember, if you ever find yourself negotiating a dowry over spilled ale, just smile, nod, and pretend you know precisely how many sheep you're supposed to provide. Picture this. You're at a medieval wedding surrounded by villagers chanting blessings, while the bride is paraded through the dirt in a giant cheese wheel. The groom wears a dunce cap for good luck, and guests fling stale herring as confetti. Welcome to nuptial insanity. Now strap on your finest ankle-biting shoes, because we're diving headfirst into the weirdest wedding traditions the Middle Ages ever cooked up. First up, the infamous cheese wheel ceremony. In parts of 14th century England, the bride was literally rolled, yes, rolled, inside a hollowed-out wheel of double Gloucester. The wheel would be hoisted onto a cart, paraded through the village, and occasionally given a push downhill to symbolize the bride's willingness to tumble into wedded bliss. Witnesses reported squeals of terror and occasional curd splatter, but tradition held that a bride who survived unscathed would enjoy a long and happy marriage, assuming the local dairy supply held up. Next, let's talk about the groom's foot race. In northern France, before vows were exchanged, prospective grooms had to dash across a muddy field while carrying a full pitcher of sour mead. If the pitcher cracked or spilled more than a thimble's worth, the wedding was postponed, and the groom was deemed too clumsy for matrimony. Imagine trudging across cow patties in your Sunday best, praying to St. Hubert that your ancestors hadn't left you with butter-slippery shoes. Meanwhile, the guests weren't off the hook. Enter the herring toss, a Scandinavian custom where the wedding party lobbed salted fish at the newlyweds as they exited the church. The higher the throw, the more fertility and prosperity you wished upon the couple. Just be careful not to bean Granny Ingrid in the face. Some villages even kept a champion herring tosser title, complete with a battered helmet fashioned from old barrels. Now, should these rituals not sufficiently baffle you, there was always the bearded bride tradition, famously documented in parts of medieval Germany. On the eve of her wedding, a woman would don a false goat hair beard soaked in onions and vinegar. She'd sit among the groomsmen at the feast, cracking jokes in a gravelly voice and challenging suitors to arm wrestling contests. The trick? Once the laughter died down, she'd remove the beard in one swift tug, symbolizing that marriage unveils one's true self, whether bearded or not. Needless to say, many a gallant knight returned home with tears in his eyes, and a lingering odor of fermented onions. But let's not forget the poignant and puzzling tradition of brides captured by water. In parts of medieval Italy, after the ceremony, the couple would be forced onto a small boat on a pond or moat. The wedding party would then attempt to capture the boat by throwing ropes and nets, dragging it to shore. The bride and groom had to team up to fend off the assault, symbolizing their first test together. Successful defense meant good fortune. Failure led to the couple being dunked headfirst into the water. Think of it as the worst amusement park ride you never chose to join. Speaking of aquatic mishaps, southwestern Europe offered the mud bath oath. Here, the bride and groom would kneel in a shallow pit filled with thick, cold mud. As they recited their vows, nearby friends would fling handfuls of the muck at them. The tradition promised richness in the soil for the couple's future crops, and an excellent source of comedic blackmail material for years to come, once those wedding portraits turned to mud clones. But wait, there's more. In medieval Poland, they practiced the legendary spice trail ceremony. The aisle to the altar was strewn not with flower petals, but a trail of pungent spices, black pepper, mustard seed, and the ever-vexing asafoetida. Couples who managed to navigate the tear-inducing fog without sneezing were said to have immune marriages, immune to quarrels. Conversely, a sneeze signaled an early spat, so ushers were strategically stationed with soporific pomanders to keep the sniffles at bay. And if that doesn't make your nose twitch, consider Ireland's broomstick blessing. After the vows, the bride and groom jumped over a broom placed horizontally on the ground. But with a twist, the broom was wrapped in garlic-scented cords to ward off evil spirits. Legend held that any couple who scrambled cleanly over the garlic brooms without tripping would live free of hexes. Fall flat on your face, however, and you'd be dodging witchcraft rumors for decades. For those seeking physical evidence of devotion, the English tradition of ring and spoon duel was a crowd pleaser. The best man and maid of honor each held a jeweled ring and a wooden spoon. At the appointed moment, they'd swing the spoons at each other's heads while reciting cheeky verses. If the spoon splintered, the duel was won, and the ring bearer would be awarded a free meal at the couple's next year's feast. Few survived unscathed, but hey, weddings weren't for faint hearts. No medieval nuptials were complete without the ceremonial castle siege. In some Germanic regions, the groom's party would invade the bride's home, pretending to storm it with battering rams, actually logs, and shouts of "Surrender the lovely." Maiden. The bride's family defended the manor with buckets of water and rotten fruit. The skirmish ended only when ransom, often ale, bread, or best pair of knitted socks, was paid. This mock war reinforced both families' ability to work through conflict, or at least negotiate over spoiled plums. Then there was the infamous wedding whip. In parts of rural France, on the way to the church, the groom's friends would lightly flog the bride's ankles with braided reeds. The bride, in return, would toss them slices of spiced bread. Legend held that the light stinging ensured the bride never forgot the sweetness of marriage. Modern therapists might call it unorthodox, but medieval counselors called it proactive relationship management. Finally, for those with a flair for theatricality, the check had the masking of the spouse. Before dawn on the wedding day, both bride and groom donned grotesque wooden masks carved to exaggerate their features. Bulbous noses, gaping mouths, exaggerated chins. They then performed a short pantomime of courtship in front of witnesses, complete with slapstick pratfalls and staged serenades. At the climax, the masks were removed simultaneously, revealing their real faces and symbolizing the transition from public performance to private partnership. So there you have it, the first foray into strange medieval wedding customs: cheese wheels, herring hailstorms, goat hair beards, and water sieges. These aren't ancient myths, they're genuine pageants from the annals of history, where survival meant laughing through the absurdity. Stick around for part 2, where we'll uncover even more bizarre vows, guest-tormenting games, and the subtle art of wedding day taxes that made every feast an exercise in arithmetic agony. You won't want to miss the story of the wedding tax that required the groom to gift goats to every child under the age of 7. Imagine standing in a frozen courtyard as a jittery minstrel attempts green sleeves, while guests clutch burlap sacks filled with live frogs, because tossing amphibians at the bride as a fertility blessing was all the rage. Welcome back to our medieval wedding weirdness extravaganza. In part 2, we're unearthing even more absurd vows, guest tormenting games, and that delightful wedding day tax that had grooms handing out goats like party favors. Buckle your leather belts. This is going to get gloriously ridiculous. Let's start with the vow of the wronged goose. In many rural English parishes, the bride and groom had to swear before the entire congregation that they would never, under pain of sprained ankles, quarrel over poultry. The officiating priest would brandish a live goose, resplendent in a tiny floral wreath, and demand oaths in Old English verse. You shall not quarrel over goose or gander, nor sneak onto the porch to steal another's pander. Should you break this vow, let your foot twist and bend until you repent and your pride meets its end. Guests cheered, the goose honked in protest, and one poor uncle invariably fainted from the combined stress of live animal theatrics and theological poultry jurisprudence. Next up, the donkey-drawn dower display. To prove the bride's dowry in front of the groom's family, her father would load every valuable item, sacks of grain, chests of silver coins, and sometimes even a prize spinning wheel, onto a donkey decked out in bells and ribbons. The donkey then paraded through the crowd, braying for attention. If the donkey balked, dropped a chest, or chewed a silk scarf, the dowry value was considered dubious and subject to renegotiation. One late 13th century record bemoans a donkey that inexorably devoured 7 yards of damask before collapsing under the weight of its owner's ego. Of course, weddings often dragged on for days, and lodging became an athletic event known as the hostage room race. The groom's manor offered only a handful of guest chambers. Hence, the first arriving guests sprinted down corridors to slap their names, in charcoal, on the biting straw mattresses. Losers were banished to the attic rafters, forced to sleep on moth-eaten tapestries above the celebratory pigsty. At dawn, bleary-eyed cousins tumbled down, cursing the event's organizers for using too narrow a hallway and demanding rematches at next year's harvest festival. By the second feast, it was time for the masked barking game. Guests donned wooden masks carved with snarling wolves or hissing foxes, then took turns barking lovelorn insults at the bride and groom. Thy breath is sour as brackish pond. Thy tunic's more holes than a rat's tavern. Each insult had to rhyme. Failure to rhyme earned the masker a plastered egg to the face. The laughing bride tossed peas at the worst offenders, and the groom resorted to bribing troubadours for gentler jibes, and then wedding day taxes. Not to be outdone by mundane tithe demands, local lords imposed a nuptial levy. For every guest who attended, the groom had to gift a live goat, a handful of almonds, or an equivalent in socks. The count of goats was meticulously recorded by the reeve, who squatted on a hay bale, quill poised like a falcon. One disgruntled groom protested surely 50 goats for 100 guests is sheer madness, but was overruled when the reeve pointed out that goats made excellent wedding souvenirs, and anyway, the kingdom needs new milk supply. Thus began the hilarious sight of 100 goats bleating around the manor courtyard, tethered to wooden stakes like poor, generically festooned bridesmaids. Meanwhile, the game of pew-pilfered rings delighted both bachelor and bachelorette parties. Rings, actual wedding bands forged by the village blacksmith, were hidden under pews during the ceremony. After the recessional hymn, guests dashed back into the chapel to retrieve them. The couple watched amusedly as elderly aunts wrestled children for the prized loot. Each ring's finder could demand a boon from the bride and groom, an extra slice of honey cake, release from communal barn duty, or even, legend has it, the right to lead the next village hunt. No medieval wedding was complete without the grudge match joust. Here, single knights or disgruntled suitors challenged each other to wooden lance battles, riders in padded gambesons colliding amid cheers. The prize? The first garland of flowers flung by the bride's hand at the triumphal pavilion. But instead of simple laurel wreaths, these garlands often hid stinkweed or nettle thorns, so the victor frequently left the ceremony with a recessed handshake, a bruised ego, and prickly ankles. We mustn't forget the parson's pocket pick. After the vows, the local priest, to ensure alms and avoid bribery rumors, marched through the crowd, tapping guests on the shoulder with his stole. Each tapped guest had to hand over a coin or small trinket. If they refused, the parson loudly announced their stinginess from the pulpit, to the delight of everyone, especially the village gossip circle that catalogued each offense in a tattered ledger for future shame. Then came the conduit of curses. In some Transylvanian villages, the bride and groom traced a circle in chalk on the courtyard floor. Inside the circle, they recited ancient hex-breaking chants, forged from Slavic folk proverbs, to ward off real curses that might attend a marriage. Meanwhile, 2 local scolds, appointed as curse keepers, stood just outside the circle, brandishing broomsticks and hollering invocations like, "Begone, thou meddling spirit of sibling rivalry." The combination of nasal chanting and cackling old women made for an ambiance equal parts terrifying and absurd. But what of the bride's lament? Before the feast's grand finale, the bride mounted a makeshift stage in the great hall and lamely sung a tear-jerking ballad, complete with improvised lyrics about leaving my childhood hearth and dipping my fingers in bittersweet love. The gaggle of bridesmaids accompanied her on rattling tambourines fashioned from animal skins. The audience, moved to tears or death by monotony, tossed handfuls of crushed rose petals at the stage. The bride's final note, a squeaky, unsupported high C, was met with polite applause and an enthusiastic pelting of rotten fruit from her jittery in-laws. Finally, the grand finale, the gravel gymnastics obstacle course. As the sun dipped low, the wedding party assembled in the courtyard for a final test of endurance. The bride and groom, joined by chosen champions from each side, navigated a course strewn with slippery flagstone, barrels of mead to crawl under, and hoops of flaming kindling to leap through. Spectators placed bets, using chicken bones as currency, on who would cross first without breaking a limb or setting their britches alight. Winners received hearty hams. Losers got to drink a cocktail of fermented turnip juice and birch sap, aptly named the Tears of St. Agnes. By the time the last embers died, the bride and groom had successfully survived frogs, goats, insults, and obstacle courses. They staggered into their bridal chamber, greeted by the echo of belated cheers and a final demand, the morning after ledger. At dawn, scribes knocked on the door, tallying goats consumed, insults quoted, and eggs cracked. The couple had to sign off on the ledger before receiving their certificate of marital endurance, a vellum scroll granting them official status as survivors of the nuptial gauntlet. And that, dear viewers, is part 2 of our tour through the strangest medieval wedding traditions, where survival meant more than producing heirs. It meant outwitting goats, enduring cursing scolds, and keeping your tunic intact through unholy obstacle races. Join us next time for part 3. We'll dive into the world of honeymoon horrors, rain-soaked barges, bed bugs masquerading as new relatives, and the fabled mirror of matrimonial mayhem that showed newlyweds every flaw in each other's wardrobes. You won't believe what medieval brides did to test their husband's loyalty at dawn. Picture this. You're blinking awake in a drafty bridal chamber only to discover that your honeymoon suite is actually a converted chicken coop, complete with clucking residents and a faint whiff of last week's muck. Welcome back to Medieval Wedding Madness, Part 3, where we dive into honeymoon horrors, post-nuptial pranks, and the time-honored ritual of test thy spouse at dawn. Let's kick off with the honeymoon hobble. No romantic carriage rides here. Noble couples were lashed together at the ankle with braided hemp rope and expected to wander the manor grounds in wobbly tandem. Each stumble elicited peals of laughter from onlooking servants, who wagered on how many seconds it would take before someone face-planted into the muck. If the pair managed to reach the duck pond without a fall, it was said their union had true harmony. More often, one spouse was dragged after the other in a graceless sprawl of satin and straw. Next, the bedbearer's prank. As night fell, the newlyweds were escorted to their bridal pallet by 6 booming groomsmen, who, on a secret signal, tossed the bedroll down a steep stairwell. The bride and groom careened after it in a ragged symphony of shrieks, emerging at the bottom in a tangled heap of limbs, linens, and one very disgruntled ferret that had taken refuge in the mattress. The surviving couple was then expected to demonstrate their marital prowess by untangling themselves without tearing the bedclothes or scoring grievous bruises. Morning brought the infamous test of true sight. The bride and groom were each handed a polished bronze mirror and instructed to inspect their spouse by candlelight, separately. This wasn't a mere vanity exercise. The officiating priest peered over shoulders, searching for any unflattering reflections. Bad hair, surprise pimples, or evidence of two enthusiastic hens scratching one's backside. Should either party balk, the mirror was snatched away, and the offender spent the next fortnight scrubbing the chapel floor on hands and knees as penance for modesty undone. Then came the breakfast of regret, a steaming bowl of pottage mixed with the wedding leftovers, chicken bones, half-eaten mead-soaked honey cakes, and dubious bits of game. Guests lined up to hurl insults like, "Thy broth tastes like rabbit jail," or "Did the fowl revolt before it reached thy cauldron?" The couple managed smiles between bites, mindful that refusing the meal was tantamount to cursing the union, and might result in being forcibly fed a second bowl by the bailiff himself. With sustenance reluctantly secured, it was time for the field of folly. The groom's party and the bride's retinue squared off across a muddy meadow, armed with pumpkins filled with sour wine and sticks wrapped in nettles. The rule was simple: pelt the opposing camp until surrender. By sundown, the field resembled a scene from an apocalyptic festival. Orange pulp, half-rotted pumpkins, and nettle-whipped welts on every exposed shin. Victors earned bragging rights. Losers earned a lifetime supply of itchy mustard seed poultices. Back at the manor, the candlelit confession awaited. The couple knelt before a single flickering taper, and the parish priest, who read aloud every embarrassing detail reported by guests, snoring, flatulence, accidental nudity, compiled on the spot by quick-fingered scribes. With each confession, the bride and groom had to offer contrition, 3 genuflections, a hymn, and a promise never to repeat the offense. Breach your promise, and you'd be forced to listen to the priest's sermon on marital fidelity twice every Sunday for a month. Ah, but the pièce de résistance, the second wedding ceremony, affectionately known as the renewal of the vows. On the 3rd day, the couple donned makeshift replicas of their original garments, stitched together from scraps of the feast's tablecloths and the squire's discarded hose. They processed through the courtyard under a canopy of dried nettles while the minstrel replayed Green Sleeves on loop. In this ceremony, the priest tested their memory. The couple had to recite each other's full names, father's names, and exact dowry. No margin for error. Any mistake required them to start over, often leading to a hilariously endless loop of "What was my father's name again?" until both parties collapsed in exasperation. Not to be outdone, the bridal chamber featured the matrimonial maze. Servants rearranged tapestries and furniture overnight, transforming the room into a labyrinth of drapes, benches, and overturned chests. As dawn light filtered through arrow slits, the bride and groom had to find each other using only a single twisting rope tied around their waists. Getting lost meant a cold dunking in the horse trough. Finding one another earned a single sip of the bride's private mead stash, considered a treasure more precious than the finest silks. Just when the couple thought they'd seen it all, the manor council convened for the post-wedding arbitration. Any guest could lodge a marital grievance, from insufficient ale supply to honey cakes too dry. The couple faced an impromptu tribunal, peasants acting as jurors, armed with rotten fruit as ballots. Guilty verdicts imposed creative penalties. The guilty spouse might have to serenade the court with a bawdy ballad, perform 20 laps of the courtyard in a barrel, or treat the entire assembly to a goose roast on the spot. But perhaps the cruelest trial was the hidden heir hunt. Unbeknownst to the bride and groom, the wily squire had hidden crates full of peeping toddlers in alcoves and behind doors. At a signal, the children emerged, shrieking and chasing the couple with giggles, trying to pluck their heirloom rings. The bride and groom had to fend off the onslaught, ducking, weaving, and deflecting sticky little hands until they retrieved a single wooden cheese wedge painted gold. That wedge symbolized their firstborn's future. If they kept hold of it, they were destined for at least 2 healthy children. Lose it, and they might remain childless, or worse, cursed with twins. Let's not forget the papal proxy prank. Word had reached the chapel that the Pope himself would send a blessing scroll, though in truth it was a cleverly forged missive by the scribe's apprentice. Guests lined up to kneel before the papal bull, which declared that henceforth any argument between spouse and in-law must be settled by thumb wrestling over a bowl of pickled mushrooms. The couple had to test the decree immediately, locking arms in the great hall while onlookers placed bets on whose thumb would prevail. As dusk fell, the final spectacle unfolded, the last laugh liturgy. The couple processed back into the chapel for one final blessing, this time surrounded by jesters and minstrels in full motley. Each perform a short, improvised skit poking fun at the couple's misadventures, slipshod blankets, pumpkin assaults, and unfortunate goose honks. The bride and groom had to endure the roast, keeping straight faces, as the jester quipped, "May your union be less brittle than a pumpkin in January." At the end, they were crowned with garlands of dried heather, symbols of endurance and dry wit. And with that, dear viewers, our Part 3 crash course in medieval marriage torture comes to an end. From adrenaline-soaked chicken coops to labyrinthine bridal chambers, these honeymoon horrors tested every ounce of marital resolve. Tune in for Part 4, where we'll explore widowhood rites, remarriage ruses, and the clandestine freedoms of the unwed. Because in the Middle Ages, life after I do was just the beginning of the absurdity. Imagine the church bells tolling as you pace beneath a sky streaked with torchlight, only to discover your freedom now comes with mandatory broom jousting, probate court hearings, and the delightful prospect of being hunted by your own in-laws if you so much as blink at a neighbor's goat. Welcome to Part 4 of our deep dive into medieval wedding madness, widowhood rites, remarriage ruses, and the wild liberties of the unwed. Once the final echoes of I do fade, the first specter to loom is widowhood. If fate or unfortunate livestock stamping parts you from your spouse, you're thrust into a public spectacle of black fabrics, gall-nut-stained gowns, and mournful dirges that threaten to dissolve into farce. The widow's wake begins as soon as the body is lowered into its cold stone tomb. The household draperies are pulled to the windows, and every lantern dimmed to a dull flicker. Yet even in grief, the widow must maintain a strict schedule. Morning matins at dawn, a midday fast to atone for any lingering marital bliss, and evening lamentations led by the parish mourning chorus. 5 goat-voiced tenors paid to hit grievous low, notes that incite both tears and terror. Guests are required to attend, bearing black bread and vinegar-soaked cheese as signs of solidarity. Skip a service and you'll earn the widow's ire, and possibly a libelous sketch of your face circulated among the gossips. But the true test of widowhood is the trial of the broom. On the 7th day, the widow must don a stiff linen cap and receive her late husband's ceremonial broom, an heirloom once used to sweep the hearth, now repurposed as her staff of office. She must leap over it, symbolizing her readiness to cleanse the past. Leap too high or miss entirely, and onlookers will whisper that her heart remains shackled to the grave. Should she succeed, the community presents her with a new broom, woven from willow and ash, signifying rebirth. Yet rumors abound of widows who perform the leap only to find the broom replaced with a sharpened staff, courtesy of rival in-laws keen to see her stumble. Meanwhile, the widow's dower auction commences. On day 9, every piece of the late husband's estate, cows, barrels of ale, silver spoons, even his favorite hunting falcon, is displayed in the courtyard. The widow stands beside each item, entitled to claim 1/3 for her sustenance. But hungry creditors lurk in the crowd, and unscrupulous bidders disguise themselves to drive up prices, forcing her to spend precious coin to reclaim her own property. Some cunning widows anticipate this and pre-mark the silverware discreetly, so if anyone else bids on it, she can produce proof at the manorial court and demand the item back, though not without paying court fees that could have fed her household for a month. Of course, not every widow opts for solitary rule. Many leap straight into the remarriage race. By day 12, matrimonial brokers arrive, well-paid matchmakers who hawk lists of eligible widowers and widows to each other's households. Contracts are drafted on lambskin scrolls. Stipulations include the bride's continued right to her dower lands, a specified number of oxen gifted at the wedding, and, in some high-stakes alliances, clauses demanding that any children from the first marriage inherit equally. Lawyers, illiterate scribes who delegate the writing to literate monks, stand by with quills, recording every if and unless in Latin to ensure no party can wriggle free later. When the new wedding day dawns, the ceremony is a curious hybrid of dirge and festival. The bride wears half mourning black over a base of bright hues, her skirt sewn from her first wedding's tablecloths, patched with fabric from her husband's favorite hunting cloak. A single white glove on her left hand symbolizes hope, The right hand is clad in a black mitten of repentance. As she processes down the aisle, pallbearers, those same goat-voiced tenors, sing alternating stanzas of Requiem Aeternam and Gaudeamus Igitur, keeping the congregation on spiritual whiplash. Remarkably, some widows exploit the ceremony for political gain. They stage ostentatious displays of grief, overly lengthy wails, fainting spells at strategic moments, and impromptu requiem poems to elicit sympathy from powerful noble suitors. These suitors seize the opportunity to demonstrate chivalric prowess. Knights pair off in mock combat outside the chapel, brandishing lances tipped with red cloth to signify spilled blood and romantic fervor. The widow picks the victor by presenting him with a velvet glove soaked in rosewater, a gesture that seals the betrothal faster than any broker's scroll. For those determined to avoid both widowhood's expenses and remarriage's entanglements, single life holds surprising perks. Spinsters and widows who remain unwed past 30 are often dubbed fending women, and their status grants them unique privileges. They may serve as legal witnesses, roles otherwise denied to married women, and preside over minor land disputes in the manor court. A savvy spinster might accumulate small parcels of leasehold land by offering to mediate boundary disagreements for a modest fee, effectively becoming a jurist without robes. Neighbors whisper that some of these fending women grew wealthier than the local reeve, all while wearing simple shifts and refusing to tie a knot in marriage. Yet the most coveted freedom of the unwed is the pilgrim's passport. While the married couples face restrictions traveling beyond their lord's lands, fending women can secure letters of safe conduct from abbots and bishops, allowing them to peregrinate to holy sites and foreign courts alike. On these journeys, they hawk relics, pearl-encrusted pins, fragments of saintly bones, and prayer books bound in sheep leather for lucrative sums. Their networks span continents. A spinster from Cornwall might trade a fragment of St. David's cloak for a pouch of Sicilian saffron, which she sells back home for a small fortune. Back in the village, the social clubs of single women flourish under the radar of church censure. Known as the sister scribes, these clandestine circles gather in barns and hollowed oak trees to exchange news, compose secret ballads, and copy pamphlets smuggled from Paris, tales of courtly love, forbidden philosophies, and even early medical treatises. If a priest stumbles upon a meeting, they scatter like startled rabbits, leaving behind ink-stained cobwebs and cryptic quills. The sister scribe's greatest achievement? Translating a Latin book on fermentation into the local tongue and distributing it among brewers, revolutionizing ale quality, and inadvertently boosting their own tavern-balancing wealth through discreet interest on pub loans. In contrast, remarried noblewomen often find their power curtailed by stepchildren and rival kin. To cement authority, many stage the ritual of the twin candles. On the eve after the second ceremony, the new couple lights 2 thick beeswax candles and places them on either side of a carved oak chest containing their joint will. For 7 hours, they must alternately fan the flames, symbolizing a balanced union, while reciting partnership statutes. I lend you my sword, you lend me your counsel, and so on. Should one partner drop the fan or let the candle gutter, the ritual must restart, often leading to midnight vows whispered by candlelight until rooster calls end the ordeal. Yet the most mischievous remarriage ruse is the dowager's dilemma. Widows with substantial dowers sometimes feign infirmity, simulating a withered limb or feigned deafness to delay remarriage negotiations. Lords and suitors grow impatient and propose ever-increasing bribes, barrels of Malaga wine, Venetian glass beads, or even exiled troubadours as private entertainment. When offers become extravagant enough, the widow reveals her health in a theatrical cure ceremony. She huffs, she puffs, she drops the crutch, and stands tall, the astonished suitors at her feet. The dowager laughs, pockets the latest bribe, and retires to her estate's plush solar, having manipulated the marriage market like a seasoned merchant. At the apex of matrimonial mayhem stands the communal widows' ball. Held once a year in the Great Hall, it invites all eligible widows to dance with any unmarried man, stepchild, nephew, or traveling minstrel. Each widow dons a uniquely dyed veil, scarlet, emerald, or cerise, to signal her preferred dowry size. The dance is a complex reel. Partners swap veils mid-dance, negotiate bride prices through tap routines, and deliver improvised rhymes extolling their virtues. By night's end, many pairings emerge, some headed to betrothal, others to business partnerships, like joint management of the village tannery or co-investment in a barley shipment. Even the church grudgingly tolerates the widow's ball, recognizing its diplomatic value. Bishops sometimes drop in to bless matches that strengthen the local economy, say a widow with a mill marrying a millwright. Yet they tighten moral screws by requiring confessions of excessive jigging and imposing small fines of salted anchovies on anyone caught in immodest cheek touchings. The fines finance a traveling sermon troupe that tours neighboring parishes on the evils of revelry, ensuring the ball's reputation as both a matrimonial marketplace and a moral battleground. And for our final flourish, the secret sisterhood soiree. Once a year, on the night of All Hallows, the sister scribes and fending women convene in the crypt beneath the abbey. There, they share coded letters from crusaders, read the latest treatises on women's health, and practice clandestine rituals stolen from pre-Christian times, dancing around an effigy of Freya for fertility, boiling oak bark to brew memory wine, and tracing runes on blades of grass to protect unmarried sisters from harm. These rites, part spiritual rebellion, part practical magic, forge bonds deeper than any marriage contract, reminding every woman that her worth transcends broom leaps, dowry auctions, and marriage markets. So there you have it, the grand finale of medieval wedding mayhem. We've traversed the gauntlet from livestock and ladies' cap feasts to dower-defying dowager pranks, and from widows' wails to spinsters' spoils. In a world of itchy wolves, leaky tiled roofs, and ravenous rodents, medieval men and women found ways to turn obligation into absurdity, and in doing so discovered resilience, wit, and unexpected agency. Whether you march at dawn to override a broom joust or slip away under a crimson veil to brew potion ales in hidden crypts, history proves it's not the vows that define you, it's how cleverly you survive them. Picture yourself negotiating the exact number of goats, barrels of wine, and pounds of pepper you'll be handing over on your wedding day, because your future happiness depends on your family's ability to count livestock and curry favor. Welcome to the bewildering world of dowries, where love got a price tag, brides were appraised like fine livestock, and marriages were economic survival schemes disguised as romantic unions. In the dawn of civilization, dowries were less about silk gowns and more about survival essentials. Imagine you're a Bronze Age villager. Your daughter's hand in marriage means forging alliances between tribes, pooling grain reserves, and perhaps transferring several prized sheep or an especially stubborn donkey to secure peace. There were no prenuptial agreements in cuneiform, but there were clay tablets listing gifts in meticulous detail, complete with witness seals pressed by trembling thumbs. The dowry was both promise and leverage, a guarantee of the wife's welfare if her husband proved a negligent shepherd or a warlord who seized new lands only to vanish on raiding parties. Fast forward to ancient Rome, where dowries, dues, became pillars of familial pride and public spectacle. A respectable Roman matron arrived at her new domicile bearing silver platters, candelabra, and enough fine linens to rival a temple's treasury. These dowries were registered before the Pontifex Maximus because the state had to ensure women retained control over their doze if the marriage soured, or if her husband was too busy conquering Gaul to provide dinner. Failure to deliver the promised dowry invited legal action. Women could sue for restitution, and magistrates would subpoena in-laws with the threat of confiscating consular robes. Tales abound of brides arriving in a litter drawn by rare horses, the weight of their dowry so immense that the litter collapsed under the combined heft of gold, spices, and dowagers' ambitions. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, dowries morphed into elaborate bartering systems designed to keep feudal lords and high-born clerics appeased. A bride from a minor noble house might bring a chest of tapestries depicting saintly miracles, a dozen casks of premium ale, and a few choice acreages of arable land. Unlike today's registry gifts, these dowries were political tools. Marriages cemented alliances, secured territorial claims, and could tip the scales in dynastic disputes. Imagine two rival barons haggling over the bride's contribution. I'll grant you 3 villages if you throw in your finest blacksmith, but I demand full title to your fisheries. Each daughter's dowry was weighed against her potential to produce heirs and muster men-at-arms. Nothing says romance like calculating future battlefield strength by the number of cows your bride brings to the altar. In the Ottoman Empire, dowries, called mehir, took on a semi-legal persona. Every groom had to promise a mehir amount before the qadi, judge, often payable on demand should he fail to honor his marital obligations. In theory, this protected women from neglect. A deserting husband who abandoned his wife and moved to the next province could be compelled to pay his mehir via the local court. But in practice, it inspired an entire cottage industry of fictitious brides demanding exorbitant sums. Local rumors even credit some savvy women with amassing fortunes by strategically disappearing for Hajj pilgrimages, then re-emerging to enforce their mehir rights. The system's brilliance lay in balancing male honor with female security, though both sides engaged in creative accounting. She might claim her mehir grew by interest every year. He might request reasonable delay while his caravan returned from silk markets. Over on the Indian subcontinent, dowries, or dahej, reached mythic proportions. Long before the British Raj, wealthy families lavished brides with jewelry so heavy they needed sedan chairs with reinforced beams. Gold necklaces, pearl-studded crowns, and gem-encrusted sandals filled entire vaults, their contents so dazzling that palace corridors glowed at night from buried wealth. But dahej was a double-edged sword. While an ostentatious dowry conferred respect and ensured a daughter's comfortable household, failure to deliver incited social ostracism and sometimes violent reprisals. Stories tell of brides abandoned on temple steps when their in-laws claimed the exchange of gold coins was faulty, forcing them to return home with nothing but torn saris and bitter hearts. Dahej disputes could escalate to demands for dowry revenge, a dark ritual of property seizures and familial exile. In Renaissance Europe, dowries blended tradition with emerging notions of personal wealth. Merchant classes in Italian city-states began negotiating dowries in cash rather than cattle or wheat. A Venetian bride might bring 2,000 ducats to her marriage, enough to underwrite a small merchant vessel. These funds underpinned joint economic ventures. Husbands and wives formed trading partnerships, invested in spice runs, and shared profits. Venetian women of means became silent partners in mercantile empires, their dowries serving as seed capital for trans-Mediterranean trade. Yet these were still patriarchal contracts. A woman's financial contribution vanished into her husband's ledgers on marriage, only to re-emerge upon widowhood when she regained control of her dowry and any accrued interest. Let's not neglect sub-Saharan Africa, where dowries often involved livestock rather than coin. Among the Maasai, a groom presented his bride's family with a solemn herd of cattle, each animal representing a vow, one for respect, one for fidelity, one for children, and so on. The herd's size signified the groom's standing. A warrior with 20 cows proved his valor. One with a single goat risked jeers from the village elders. Ceremony dictated that each cow be ceremonially milked by the bride's mother, symbolizing mutual nourishment, while the bride herself led a procession of grazers through the homestead. These rituals underlined marriage as a communal contract. The groom's ability to herd guaranteed the couple's future prosperity, and the bride's acceptance of each cow sealed her new identity as caretaker of the homestead's wealth. Across the Pacific, Polynesian societies fused dowries with gift exchange reciprocity. In Tonga, nuptial exchange involved fine mats, hand-woven tapa cloth, alongside pigs, yams, and baskets of coconut oil. A bride's family offered the fala as tokens of goodwill, while the groom's clan reciprocated with kolua, a collection of fine mats and tapa. These gifts weren't one-sided, they flowed both ways, strengthening inter-clan relationships more than establishing economic advantage. The Tongan system celebrated mutual respect, ensuring that neither family felt exploited, a stark contrast to the rigid dowry demands of other cultures. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European attitudes toward dowries began to shift under Enlightenment influence. Philosophers lambasted dowries as mercenary relics, arguing that marriage should be a contract of mutual affection, not a financial transaction. Yet the law still recognized dowries in many jurisdictions. In France, the Napoleonic Code codified dowry rights. Husbands had to manage their wife's dowry prudently and could not dissipate it through gambling or poor investments. Violation entitled the wife to claim her dowry back with interest. These legal protections offered women a rare foothold in property rights, even as romantic novels decried the very notion of bride price. In Victorian England, dowries became a marker of social ambition. Landed gentry used dowries to offset the career uncertainties of younger sons. A duke's 10th child, destined for the church or military, could parlay a modest dowry into a secure clerical living or an officer's commission. Brides arrived at Dowries negotiations with portable china services, rare botanical collections, and family portraits by renowned artists. Yet beneath the genteel facade lurked financial desperation. Families scraped every shilling to secure advantageous matches, and bachelors' clubs in London bespoke groups of older sons waiting for dowries to dry up among their sisters. Meanwhile, in the United States, dowries largely faded among Anglo-American Protestants but persisted among immigrant communities. In New Orleans, Creole families maintained French dowry customs, filling cassolettes with Louisiana rice and sugarcane syrup as bridal gifts. Jewish immigrants brought the ketubah, a marriage contract safeguarding the bride's dowry and stipulating her maintenance. These traditions underscored cultural continuity amidst transatlantic upheaval, even as mainstream Americans embraced companionate marriage ideals. The 20th century brought further transformations. Economic challenges of the world wars saw dowries shrink or vanish. Women's increased labor force participation shifted marriage from economic necessity to romantic partnership. Yet dowries lingered in rural and traditional societies. In parts of South Asia, dowry practices hardened, evolving into dowry demands that fueled social crises. Brides were still expected to arrive at matrimonial homes laden with jewelry, appliances, and money, turning weddings into transactional spectacles. Legal reforms in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh attempted to outlaw dowry extortion, but enforcement often lagged behind entrenched social norms. Today, the legacy of dowries can be seen in the global wedding industry's commercialization. Bridal registries, gift registries, and white elephant gift exchanges owe their origins to dowry traditions, modern, consumerist echoes of ancient livestock bartering. Yet the dark side remains. Where dowry demands go unmet, marriages can collapse, and brides face harassment or violence. NGOs worldwide campaign against dowry-related abuse, while social media movements encourage bride price refunds and dowry-free weddings. As we wrap up this first leg of our journey, remember, dowries were never just about trinkets and treasures. They were survival strategies, political tools, and expressions of cultural values. From clay tablets in Mesopotamia to dowry auctions in medieval courts, from Tongan mats to Venetian ducats, dowries shaped how societies viewed marriage, property, and gender roles. And though the world has moved toward companionate unions, the ghosts of dowry bargains linger in both our legal codes and wedding traditions. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive deeper into medieval dowry haggling, scandalous dowry disputes, and the bizarre customs that turned brides into pawns in dynastic chess games. You won't believe the time a dowry dispute sparked an actual siege of a castle, complete with catapults and half-naked swordsmen demanding their due. In the gray dawn of medieval markets, the negotiation of a bride's dowry was less a romantic exchange and more a gladiatorial contest of wills, complete with haggling over hens, acreage, and Aunt Gertrude's priceless salt cellar. Imagine two clans converging on the Lord's great hall, the bride's entourage clutching rolls of parchment listing every promised gift, the groom's party armed with grim determination and an abacus. The first volley was cattle, 10 kine for Our Lady Matilda's honor. Ha! You'd need 15 for half our lands. Each cow counted represented not only feasting meat, but the muscle to plow fields and the milk to keep infant heirs alive through winter starvation lean. Next came the great grain reckoning. Sacks of barley and wheat, measured by peck and bushel, were slammed onto the oaken table like battering rams, sending clouds of dust into the rafters. The bride's father insisted on prime spring-sown stock. The groom's uncle, a shrewd reeve, tested each sack with a wooden probe. If a grain crushed to dust, accusations flew. Adulterated grain to cheat the Lord. You'd accuse your own kin of theft for a single stray flake. All the while, scribes furiously tallied ledgers by flickering candlelight, praying their quills held out until the final accord. Then came the woven treasures, tapestries, and linens prized for both warmth and bragging rights. Noble houses woke their best seamstresses months in advance, stitching scenes of unicorn hunts and pastoral idylls into sumptuous drapes. These were hauled in on tired wagons, rolled, unrolled, and sniffed for moth damage, while the groom's party inspected every stitch. A single loose thread could trigger renegotiation. Your seamstress clearly favors idleness. Well, your huntsman clearly favors boar steaks over salt for preservation. The air crackled with outrage and amusement in equal measure. Silverware and jewelry followed, goblets, candlesticks, and rings hammered by the blacksmith's apprentices. One infamous dowry session nearly descended into fisticuffs when the bride's brother brandished a silver spoon so heavy it left dents in the hall's flagstone. The groom's cousin sneered that the spoon was less silver than village gossip, provoking a retort about the cousin's own cloak being less wool than moth fancy. In the din of clashing insults, the steward pounded his staff on the floor to command silence, then promptly forgot whose side he represented. Land grants were the true prize, parcels of meadow, strips of woodland, and rights to fish the riverbank. Here, the negotiations turned solemn, for every acre counted toward power. The groom's side demanded clear boundaries, stone markers, old oaks, and even the occasional grave marker of long-dead forebears to define the dowry's expanse. Disputes erupted over ambiguous landmarks. That ancient thorn bush has moved since last spring. Nonsense! It's rooted to last millennium. Long-faced jurists were summoned to arbitrate, wielding leather-bound statutes older than most attendees, while nobles quarreled over forests. Peasants haggled over pigs. A swine was worth a laborer's week of work. A litter of piglets equaled a season's plowshare. The bride's family brought squealing charms to prove their stock's fertility. The groom's kin shot back with tales of lean swine flayed for sausages. Children watched wide-eyed as squeals echoed through the courtyard, simultaneous proof that the dowry lived and that someone's dinner was at stake. Finally, the ceremonial sealing. The great horn of mead passed between the families. Each sip ratified the agreement, but none swallowed until the last mouthful, lest the entire contract evaporate like foam on the drink. As the horn emptied, a hush fell, then broke into laughter when the steward belched so thunderously that everyone assumed it a sign of divine approval. Of course, not all dowry negotiations ended in peace. In one notorious incident, a baron's refusal to honor a minor addition, a carved wooden chest, sparked a 3-day siege of the bride's family manor. Catapulted pumpkins flew alongside missives demanding recompense, and half-naked swordsmen harassed the kitchen staff until the missing chest was produced, battered but intact. Only then did both sides agree that honor had been sufficiently satisfied, and that perhaps next time they'd avoid air-launched gourds. By twilight, with quills stubbed and tempers cooled, the witnesses signed their names in squid ink scrawls. The dowry deed was sealed in wax and locked away in the keep, destined to resurface at future disputes, or, more likely, as thrilling bedtime reading when grandchildren demanded tales of Granny's great goat debacle. Thus concluded the medieval dowry. Haggling, a pageant of livestock, grain, silver, and sheer stubborn pride. It was a spectacle where every gift bore weight, literal and political, and where the bride's value was measured not by affection, but by the heft of her family's offerings. Stick around for part 3, where we'll plunge into scandalous dowry disputes, legal battles that rattled kingdoms, and the bizarre customs that turned brides into pawns, and sometimes queens, in the dynastic chess games of history. You won't believe how one missing wedding chest nearly altered succession laws. Let's plunge into the scandalous dowry disputes that rattled dynasties and turned drawing rooms into courtrooms. In 13th century Provence, Lady Isabeau of Orange arrived at her betrothal with a dowry chest so splendid, crimson damask, gold-embroidered falcons, and a quarter-year's yield of saffron, that her future father-in-law drooled openly. Yet when the chest failed to appear at the local mairie on the wedding morn, having mysteriously stayed behind in the village of Grasse, diplomatic panic ensued. The groom's family dispatched half a dozen armed retainers to retrieve the chest or negotiate terms, while Isabeau's mother countered by locking the chest in a tower and publicly reading an oath that no suitor would see the bride until the chest was unharmed. After 3 weeks of fruitless cat and mouse, the chest emerged, slightly moth-eaten and missing its silver goblets. But Isabeau's new husband had already filed suit before the Parlement of Aix, demanding full restitution plus interest. The ensuing judgment forced the bride's family to surrender the village church's keys as collateral until the goblets were replaced. Meanwhile, in 15th century Castile, the dowry duel took a more literal turn. When Doña Beatriz de Córdoba claimed her late husband had misappropriated half her dowry lands, Her brother challenged the offending noble to a judicial combat. In full armor, they met at dawn in the Plaza Mayor, lances at the ready. Doña Beatriz watched from her balcony, her lace veil fluttering like a banner. After a rancorous tilt, the suitor's horse bolted, scared by the onlookers cheering, and threw him into a muddy fountain. Technically, the duel ended in favor of Beatrice's brother, granting her entire dowry back plus damages for public humiliation. Legal battles over dowries could escalate into plundering armies. In 16th century Eastern Europe, the marriage of Princess Katerina to the Duke of Mazovia hinged on a dowry of 200 fine sable pelts. When only 80 pelts arrived, stolen en route by Cossack raiders, the Duke seized a merchant's caravan as recompense, igniting a week-long border skirmish that left 2 villages burned and several disputing nobles dead. The peace treaty, remarkably, included a clause stipulating future dowries, travel under royal escort, escorted by at least 20 mounted guards and a priest, to recite protective prayers along the border. Nordic lands saw their own dowry conflicts. In medieval Norway, a widow's right to her dower third was guaranteed by law, but enforcement often faltered. After Earl Sigurd died, his widow, Sigrid the Resolute, demanded her third of the vast Arctic salmon fisheries. Her late husband's brother, the new earl, refused, claiming Sigrid's marriage contract had been scribbled on perishable birch bark, and thus void. Sigrid responded by hiring mercenary Vikings, who blockaded the earl's port with longships and demanded tolls on every incoming trading vessel. Only when King Haakon intervened, reminding the earl that birch bark contracts counted as legitimate under royal decree, did peace return, and Sigrid gained control of her rightful fisheries, plus one of the earl's finest longboats as a peace. Offering in the Ottoman realm, dowry fraud became an art form. In Bursa, a young merchant woman agreed to a marriage on condition her mahir include 1,000 silver coins. On the wedding day, she presented 1,000 copper coins painted silver, a trick so clever that the local Kada initially approved the union, before the bride's aunt exposed the deception with a pocket magnifying glass. The groom's family sued for annulment. The Kada, caught between legal precedent and pity, decreed that half the coins must be returned but the marriage would stand, provided the groom waived half his mahir rights forever. Rumor says the bride's aunt became the Sultan's new glass grinder, supplying magnifying lenses to courts across Anatolia. Perhaps the most bizarre dowry feud took place in Mughal India. Princess Jahanara's dowry, promised by Emperor Shah Jahan to her suitor general, included 500 elephants adorned in velvet caparisons. When only 499 elephants appeared, one having escaped into the imperial polo fields, the general stormed the court, demanding restitution or death. Shah Jahan, amused, simply had the missing elephant's name erased from the imperial registry and declared the matter closed. The general, graciously appeased by a personally embroidered pelt, dropped the complaint, and the runaway elephant became a local legend, credited with single-trunkedly saving a village from famine. These disputes weren't limited to royalty. In Tudor England, commoners faced their own dowry quandaries. When Mary Thistleworth's dowry of 6 chickens and a goat vanished on the wedding night, allegedly stolen by her groom in a drunken stupor, her family pressed charges at the manorial court. The judge ordered the groom to wear a placard reading "Chicken Thief" for a fortnight, and to host a communal feast of 6 chickens and a goat at his own expense. This public shaming ensured that future suitors thought twice before confusing dowry with dinner. Even religious vows intersected with dowry rites. In 17th century France, women who entered convents were expected to bring a dowry to support their orders. Sister Madeleine of Dijon, unable to provide monetary dowry, offered instead her family's vineyard, only to see the convent's landlord seize the lands and rent them back at steep rates. Madeleine, refusing to let her family's patrimony slip away, led a breakout of 12 nuns who petitioned the king directly. Their plea won royal favor. The vineyard was returned, and the abbey was temporarily exempted from rent, setting a precedent that nunneries could not exploit dowry provisions at the expense of their sisters. These tales of dowry disputes reveal how marriage contracts could ignite legal duels, border conflicts, and even armed rebellions. But amid the chaos, dowries also provided women with leverage and security, tools to reclaim property, assert rights, and sometimes reshape political landscapes. As we've seen, a missing chest, a miscounted pelt, or a disputed parchment could spin entire kingdoms into turmoil. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll expose the underbelly of dowry culture, its role in witch trials, dowry debt bondage, and the unexpected ways brides fought back, transforming from powerless pawns into shrewd negotiators of their own fates. You won't believe how dowries fueled the rise of early women's rights long before the Enlightenment. And so, we arrive at the dark underbelly of dowries, where a broken promise could brand you a witch, leave you bound in debt servitude, or, if you were clever, transform you into the family's most fearsome negotiator. In parts of early modern Europe, unpaid dowries became evidence of witchcraft. A widow who couldn't pay her late husband's promised dower found herself accused of devouring her spouse's spirit with malevolent forces. Magistrates dredged up any odd behavior, collecting herbs, staying up past curfew, or simply knowing too much about household accounts, and declared that only a pact with the devil could explain her financial independence. Trial by ordeal took many forms, dunking in icy water until she either drowned, proof of guilt, or survived, proof of innocence, pricking her flesh for witches' marks that bled too freely, or burning invoices in a bonfire to see if they reappeared. Unscorched, convicted women were stripped of their dowry, publicly shamed in stocks, and sometimes executed, leaving entire estates in legal limbo until distant heirs stepped forward. Meanwhile, in parts of Eastern Europe, dowry debt bondage was codified in law. A bride whose family defaulted on dowry installments could find herself indentured to her husband's family, sewing fine linens beyond dawn, tending flocks until dusk, and hauling water at midnight. Each day's labor counted against the unpaid balance. 5 hours of spinning equaled 1 head of cattle, 10 hours of baking equaled 1 plot of land. Debts passed from mother to daughter, creating dynasties of indentured women who memorized ledgers older than the church bells. Escape was nearly impossible. Local bailiffs kept watch, and runaway brides risked being branded vagabonds and sold to neighboring nobles. Yet among these hapless thralls, pockets of resistance took root, secret knitting circles that hid spare yarn to the value of unpaid dowries, clandestine letters smuggled to sympathetic priests, and, on the boldest occasions, midnight escapes too. Convents offering sanctuary in exchange for unpaid labor. But not all brides went quietly into servitude. In the courts of 17th century France, a small cadre of noble women turned dowry disputes into political theater. They'd arrive for negotiations wearing contrasting gloves, one white silk, one black leather, to symbolize the dual nature of marriage. When their in-laws balked at the final payment, these women countered with theatrical fainting spells, followed by impassioned speeches about honor, virtue, and the sacred bond of mutual trust. Cameras may not have existed, but court gossip scribes immortalized their performances in damning detail. Madame de la Tour refused to return to her family's chateau until the entire sum was delivered on a silver salver, or she would petition the Parlement of Paris to overturn all local marriage contracts. The spectacle often forced reluctant husbands to secure loans, raise taxes on their peasants, or, even more humiliating, pawn their swords to fulfill a wife's rightful claim. In colonial America, dowry restitution movements foreshadowed early women's rights activism. In Puritan New England, widows petitioned town meetings for their dower thirds, arguing from scripture and natural law that a woman is no man's chattel but God's own creature. They wielded petitions signed by dozens of neighbors, men and women, alike, proclaiming their virtue and right to support. When judges balked, these widows organized petition fasts, standing outside the meeting house with placards reading, "Give me what is mine," and refusing to consume anything but water until justice was served. Their tactics worked. Towns granted back unpaid dowries, revised ordinances to prevent future defaults, and, most importantly, set early precedents for women's public advocacy. Across the Mediterranean, dowry rebellions took more literal form. In 18th century Sicily, peasant brides whose families couldn't muster the agreed-upon goats and olive oil organized dowry raids on noble storehouses. Under cover of night, they slipped into barns, swapped their own shabby cooking pots for valuable amphorae, and vanished amidst olive groves. These small-scale thefts weren't mere larceny. They were symbolic uprisings against a system that treated marriage as a poverty sentence for the poor and a profit engine for the rich. Local landlords retaliated by torching olive presses, but the raids continued, driven by a simple credo whispered among young women: better to steal a jar of oil than beg for pennies. The most spectacular example of a bride fighting back occurred in Mughal India, when Princess Zeb-un-Nissa's dowry, the largest ever promised to a provincial governor, was mysteriously lost en route. Rather than meekly accepting an apology, she dispatched her own caravan, unstoppable camels bearing armed eunuchs and legal scrolls stamped with the emperor's seal. The governor's relatives found themselves besieged in his own fortress, forced to negotiate Zeb-un-Nissa's full dowry delivery, or face imperial wrath. The princess's caravan returned triumphant, dowry intact, her reputation soaring as the daughter who demanded justice. Her story spread across the subcontinent, inspiring other women to demand contractual enforcement. By the dawn of the 19th century, the tide began to turn. Enlightenment ideas and legal reforms chipped away at dowry abuses. Many European countries limited dowries to modest sums, outlawed debt bondage, and recognized women's rights to property. Colonies in the New World codified companionate marriage ideals, reducing dowry to a mere symbolic gift rather than a financial obligation. Yet remnants persisted in some rural regions of Italy. Dowry funds still financed younger sons' careers. In parts of Russia, brides' jewel boxes remained off-limits to husbands. In South Asia, dowry extortion became an entrenched social ill, requiring stringent legislation. Throughout this evolution, brides who understood the power of negotiation thrived. They drafted prenuptial dowry trusts, placing their gifts in the hands of neutral trustees, abbots, local notaries, or town councils, only released upon full delivery. They appended clauses penalizing late payment with fines paid back in wine, textiles, or even personal services like teaching their own seamstresses. They insisted on multi-tiered delivery schedules, forcing grooms' families to produce a portion of the dowry at engagement, another at the feast, and the remainder at the first anniversary, ensuring layers of security against default. And when all else failed, they forged alliances with women's networks, sisterhoods of mothers, midwives, and market traders who vouched for their virtue, lent them funds to cover shortfalls, and pestered defaulting families until they relented. These informal coalitions laid early groundwork for modern credit unions and feminist cooperatives, proof that, even when dowries threatened to imprison them, women could leverage both law and community to reclaim their rightful wealth. Thus concludes our 4-part exploration of dowries, from barter chests sealed in medieval courts to the spirited rebellions of enlightened princesses, from witch hunt debt traps to the dawn of legal protections. We've seen how dowries both shackled and empowered, how brides sometimes became prisoners of promise, and other times masters of negotiation. In the end, behind every coin, cow, or casket of silk lay the relentless drive for survival, dignity, and yes, a touch of historical absurdity. If you're still with us, share your thoughts. Where would you have stashed your dowry to keep it safe? Goats in the attic? Gold hidden in a cheese wheel? Let us know, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell for more sardonic journeys into the nightmares of history. Thanks for watching, and may your own promises prove easier to keep than a bride's medieval dowry. Imagine you just tripped over the church threshold, and a black cat slips between your feet, because centuries ago that tiny stumble meant your marriage would be as wobbly as your balance. Welcome to bridal balderdash, the baffling, bone-chilling wedding superstitions medieval fools actually believed. You might think dropping the wedding ring is embarrassing today. Back then, if that precious band clattered to the stone floor, villagers whispered that your love would snap like thin iron. To prevent catastrophe, grooms' mothers carried spare rings embroidered into their kerchiefs, just in case the ring slipped off during the investiture of hands. Nothing says "I love you" like your mother-in-law offering a backup ring dipped in garlic cloves. Then there was the fearsome first look. In 12th century Germany, a bride was forbidden to see her groom before the ceremony, or risk summoning the fury of fickle fortune. Legend held that if she caught his eye early, she'd wake up her entire life haunted by the ghost of indecision, forever torn between choosing tea or meat at breakfast. To enforce this, maids led grooms in blindfolds down the aisle, like drunk treasure hunters groping for hidden gold, while the bride processed behind with a chorus of Ave Maria, muffled by hand-woven mufflers. If you thought rain on your wedding day is good luck, imagine a deluge of biblical proportions. In medieval England, reports of heraldic umbrellas scattered across muddy churchyards surfaced in damp parish records. Rain was a sign that God wept for your union, so pious couples erected colorful canopies stitched with saints' faces to catch divine tears and keep them off your velvet doublet. A dry wedding meant the heavens had turned their backs, so unlucky that some couples carried lacquered gourds filled with water, dramatically pouring them into church gutters to simulate celestial sorrow. Spiders at the feast? Don't swat them, count them. In 14th century France, spider counting became a bridal tradition. Each 8-legged guest spinning webs in the chandelier signified a year of marital blessings. But beware, 3 spiders in the soup foretold squabbles over table scraps. To avoid such domestic rancor, cooks hung sticky grease lights around the hall, trapping any snacking arachnids before the roast boar arrived. Meanwhile, in Scotland, brides carried blue ribbons, or risk a lifetime of jealousy. True, something blue wasn't just a color. It was a ward against banshees of bitter regret. Without that ribbon, a bride's spirit was said to wander the highlands at night, wailing curses on every sheep she passed. The color blue, associated with loyalty and truth, had to be sourced from the local woad crop, sometimes mixed with tears of distressed bridesmaids for extra potency. And don't get me started on the ominous omen of the owl. If an owl hooted near the church, congratulations, your marriage would be plagued by silent nights and mysterious shadows. Rural Welsh couples hired professional owl chasers, men equipped with torches and flutes, to serenade any suspicious strigiforms away from consecrated ground. The chase often devolved into drunken bonfires, with villagers tossing bits of stale bread lest the owls return seeking midnight snacks. Further south, in Italy, buschi bands, crowds of village children, formed at the bride's door at dawn, singing riddles that foretold her future. If she answered wrong, they'd demand shriving, little penances like barefoot laps around the well. Get caught in a wrong-footed answer, and the children tossed bouquets laced with nettles at you, promising prickly gossip at every market stall for months. And let's not forget the vinegar dip vow. In parts of Galicia, grooms dip their gloves in vinegar before the kiss, symbolizing the sour trials ahead and preparing their lips for any bitter words. A groom who forgot this solemn vinegar anointing risked a year of sour temper, legendary for throat-burning arguments over spilled wine and mismatched socks. By the time you reached the wedding breakfast, your nerves were already shot. To stave off bad luck, guests brought lucky slices of cakes baked that morning, each bearing hidden charms: rings for children, thimbles for sewing prowess, and tiny stones said to ward off gout. Crack open the cake and swallow the charm whole. Just pray it wasn't a stone, or you'd spend the night battling digestive unrest instead of toasting the happy couple. So there you have it, the first glimpse into the wild superstitions that governed matrimonial madness. Stay tuned. Next up, we'll plunge into part 2, uncovering cursed cakes, bewitched bouquets, and the hair-raising hair of the spouse, ritual guaranteed to make you question every floral arrangement at your own wedding. You won't believe how ancient brides made sure their maid of honor didn't steal their future, by smearing her slippers with lard at dawn. Imagine the church doors creaking open only to reveal your new in-laws brandishing a live toad, because centuries ago that slimy amphibian was your surest ticket to fertility. Welcome back to Bridal Balderdash Part 2. We're diving headfirst into cursed confections, bewitched bouquets, and bridal beauty rituals so bizarre they'd make you abandon cake for captivity. Let's start with poltergeist pudding. In 16th century Wales, a wedding feast wasn't complete without a steaming vat of black pudding, so infused with superstitious dread that guests whispered it was haunted by the groom's jealous ex. Legend held that if a spoonful quivered on its own, it meant phantoms of broken engagements loitered in the hall. To exorcise these love-lost spirits, the bride's father tossed a pinch of salt into the pudding pot. If it fizzed like a witch's cauldron, the exorcism succeeded. If not, the kitchen cat was blamed and banished to the roof until the next full moon. Now, onto the bewitched bouquet. In Renaissance Italy, every bridal bouquet doubled as a magical trap. Florists, secretly apprenticed to local apothecaries, studded bouquets with sleeping herbs like rosemary, lavender, and sometimes belladonna. The idea? A whiff of the arrangement would calm the bride's nerves and ward off prying spirits. But gossip warns that too much belladonna gave brides hallucinatory visions of wedding nightmares. runaway carriages, disappearing priests, and singing gargoyles. To balance the dose, bouquets were delivered by masked couriers, because seeing the bouquet bearer's face was said to transfer your luck to them. Poor couriers often vanished into crowded piazzas, leaving only petals in their wake. Next, the toast of true sight. In Tudor England, wedding toasts were laced with superstition. Let the bride's cup clink too gently against the groom's, and rumors said you'd lose your voice the next morning. Should the glass shatter, doomed couples face 7 years of bad luck, or at least 7 months of sharing a broom closet. To prevent such calamities, guests carried small wooden clappers and tapped them instead of crystal, preserving vocal cords and china alike. The bride, in turn, often sipped from a pewter goblet etched with runes to repel ear-splitting curses. Then, there's the warding wedding bell. Across medieval Europe, churches hung tiny protective bells at the chapel entrance, so small only mice could tinkle them. As the couple passed beneath, the bells chimed a delicate chime, supposedly clearing the air of malevolent whispers. One legend claims a Saxon bride sneezed so violently at this moment that the bell's clapper flew out, embedding in her veil. She kept it as a talisman, convinced it absorbed every bad word ever spoken about her marriage. Speaking of sneezes, the sneezing omen was taken deadly serious in 15th century Burgundy. A single sneeze during the vow exchange foretold a tragic love triangle involving a miller, a nun, and a traveling jester. To counter this risk, the best man carried a pouch of dried pennyroyal seeds. Whenever a tickle in the nose threatened to betray the bride's poise, he tossed a handful at her feet, distracting both her sinuses and any potential scandal. Let's travel to Norway for the frozen footfall fetish. There, foot warmers called brudamok were strapped beneath the bride's shoes, bags of heated stones wrapped in furs, to prevent her from stepping on any unseen runes etched into doorways. Villagers believed icy feet invited frost spirits who'd freeze marital passions solid. Without brudamok, couples risked waking up to find their homes encased in ice and their honeymoon reduced to hypothermia. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, the cursed cake slice held immense power. Before the wedding, the baker hid a single coin inside one slice of honey-sweet wedding cake. Whoever cut that slice was said to command the next decade's blessings, often sparking mad rushes as guests jostled the slice first. If an unlucky child found the coin, tradition demanded they lead the bride and groom around the table 3 times, raining petals overhead. Should they forget a lap, they were banned from weddings for a year, an edict enforced by notorious Aunt Clara, self-appointed keeper of the cake slice code. In 17th century Spain, brides wore protective pins, thin metal needles inscribed with Salvadoran prayers hidden in their veils. The pins were believed to pierce any curses cast by jealous relatives or spiteful neighbors, but a misplaced pin led to Queen Isabella's infamous velvet veil scandal, when a pin slipped into the groom's tunic and he ended up twitching uncontrollably all through the ceremony. Court doctors blamed excessive zeal, but gossip attributed it to a powerful curse, until a Spanish monk revealed the pin, blessing it back into safety with holy water. Now, consider the banishing bread ritual of Normandy. On the morning of the wedding, each guest received a fragment of stale bread stamped with a protective rune. If any crumb crumbled too easily, it signaled hidden gossip among the guests, so the crumb-bearing guest had to publicly confess a petty sin before eating it. Those brave enough to munch down without confessing faced a night of restlessness and interminable wedding speeches. Then there's the prying pearl protocol. In Moorish Andalusia, brides wore strings of Baroque pearls around their necks, each pearl representing a vow. Should one pearl fall, the couple was required to kneel and vow again before the city's lead astrologer. Legend says that Al-Mu'tadi, the caliph's bride, lost a pearl mid-procession and halted the entire wedding for 6 hours, as astrologers charted the stars to confirm the union's stability. The wedding feast ran out of dates and honeyed wine. The guests revolted, and the astrologer gained permanent favor. Finally, for this segment, the last-minute luck lamp. In rural Austria, a single candle was lit in every window on the eve of the wedding, each flame a beacon for wandering spirits or lost ancestors. If any candle guttered out, the spirits were said to snatch marital joy away. Early in the morning, the bride inspected each lamp. A single flicker meant she'd spend the rest of her life searching for lost keys, misplaced knitting needles, and perhaps her own happiness. And that wraps up part 2 of our sardonic stroll through wedding superstitions. From haunted puddings to runaway pearls, these rituals remind us that behind every vow lay a world terrified of tiny mishaps spiraling into epic curses. Stick around for part 3, where we'll expose the dark arts of cursed rings, rage-inducing rituals, and the hair-raising mirror of matrimonial truth that left brides questioning their entire life choices. You won't believe how they use mirrors to keep an eye on invisible specters. Picture this: you slip the wedding ring onto your finger, only to find it inexplicably twisted backward because your betrothed forgot the right ring ritual held to prevent cursed unions. Welcome back to Bridal Balderdash Part 3, where we dive into forbidden mirrors, bewitched belts, and ring-fueled ruination that had newlyweds calling for exorcists instead of cake. Next up, the Ring of Reflection. In 15th century Bohemia, rings weren't simply slipped on. They were passed beneath a polished bronze mirror 3 times to absorb only positive reflections. Brides and grooms would stand opposite one another, holding the ring aloft as servants spun the mirror. If the ring's image fractured or flickered, it meant ancestral spirits weren't pleased, and an immediate seance was summoned before the priest. Failure to convene medium and exorcist meant whispered accusations of impending divorce when the first chore, usually milking the goat, went awry. Then came the belt of bewitchment. In medieval Spain, grooms presented brides with leather belts adorned with tiny iron nails. These nail belts were believed to ward off jealous curses, each nail hammered in by a different smith to disperse malice. However, if the bride felt a pinprick on her waist during the first night, superstition dictated that her husband had a secret paramour. To counter, on the second morning, the bride would remove the belt, fill the holes with molten lead, sealing away jealousy, and toss the re-hardened belt into the communal hearth. The ensuing sparks were said to incinerate lingering spite. Across the Alps, the hearthstone oath bound couples to their home, and occasionally doomed them. In rural Tyrol, the bride and groom sprinkled consecrated salt onto a special hearthstone before lighting a fire together. Should the flame sputter or the salt clump, villagers took it as a sign the union would founder on domestic drudgeries: burnt porridge, scorched wash, and endless bickering over whose turn it was to tend the fire. To restore the hearth's favor, the couple had to kneel before the local firekeeper and recite a 108-line poem praising Saint Florian, patron of flames. Let's talk about the chicken's curse. In parts of Saxony, a hen was paraded around the bridal chamber before dawn, its feathers plucked one by one while the bride recited vows. Each feather meant a year of wedded bliss. Each unplucked feather, due to the hen's frantic squirming, heralded a year of squabbles. To prevent straggler feathers, brides often bribed the poultry handler with extra grain, because nothing says romance like feeding livestock for your own happiness. Now, the brooch of betrayal. In Tudor England, a bride pinned her gown with a jeweled brooch, borrowed from her grandmother. After the vows, the maid of honor removed it and hid it before breakfast. Should the groom fail to locate the brooch by sunset, superstition decreed he was unworthy, accusing him of deceit and presaging infidelity. Happy grooms dispatched pages across manor grounds, overturning flower pots and chasing chickens until the brooch was found, often within a dusty nook in the custard kitchen, leaving the bride to smirk at his panicked scramble. In Venetian courts, the masked utterance was a delightful nightmare. Before the ceremony, the bride and groom donned half-masks carved from laurel wood, symbolizing the half-truths each spouse kept hidden. Once masks were affixed, no words could be spoken for the first 15 minutes. Silence was thought to bind secrets safely until after the feast. Should the couple break the vow of silence, an ominous bell tolled, and guests shouted out random scandals. Lady Anna's cousin still owes for last year's dowry, forcing the bride's family to placate the offended party with fresh fish and a public apology. Let's not forget the weeping willow wreath. In parts of Poland, brides braided crowns from willow branches dipped in holy water and hung them above their bridal chamber door. The willow's drooping limbs symbolized sorrow at leaving home. If the wreath wilted faster than the morning dew, villagers assumed the bride's heart was already drifting back to her mother's hearth. Midwives then recited lullabies beneath the wreath until it regained vigor, sometimes taking days, delaying the consummation and testing the groom's patience and bladder. Further east, among the Rus, the candle and comb ritual tested fidelity. On the eve of the wedding, the bride placed a lit beeswax candle beneath her bed and tied a silver comb to the footboard. If, upon awakening, the candle burned low, but the comb lay undisturbed, it signified marital fidelity. Should the candle gutter or the comb shift, villagers declared the spouse guilty of secret liaisons. To avert this, many brides kept thrice-blessed beeswax candles and asked godparents to stand guard through the night, ensuring no unexpected breezes or mischievous mice could spoil their omen. Around the Mediterranean, the shadow stake stood guard. In Sicily, couples processed through the church courtyard under a stake of thorn branches, blackened by incense smoke. This shadow stake captured stray spirits that might cling to the couple. Each thorn pricked on the way out was carefully collected and buried under the threshold of the bridal chamber, preventing phantoms of past lovers from slipping back in. Farmers still find rusted thorn clusters under ancient thresholds, proof that the superstitions left literal stakes embedded in history. And then there was the wine-glass whisper. In Provence, brides sipped from carved wooden goblets imbued with inscriptions of sweet nothings. After tasting the wine, the bride whispered her deepest hope into the cup, which was then shattered. Guests collected shards and burned them in a pyre. If the smoke curled skyward in spirals, it meant the vow would come true. If the smoke plumed straight, tragedy loomed. Some grooms, desperate to hear good news, slipped pockets of dried lavender, believed to send smoke spirals, into the hearth to guarantee a favorable omen. No superstition was complete without the naming knot. In medieval Ireland, after the ceremony, the couple stood on a ceremonial cloth while the priest tied 9 knots in a length of thread, each knot binding them to a virtue, fidelity, courage, patience, and so on. The knots were then cut and each spouse tied one end around their wrist. Should the thread snap in the first fortnight, the villagers interpreted it as a sign the union lacked at least one essential virtue, prompting immediate pilgrimage to a local saint's shrine to beg for reinforcement. Finally, the unlucky umbra. In parts of Brittany, the bride carried a miniature iron mirror engraved with a motif of a raven and never allowed her shadow to fall upon it. Should her reflection catch its own shadow, superstition decreed she would forever see faults in her spouse. To avoid this, attendants held lanterns at her back throughout the ceremony, ensuring her shadow fell only on stone walls, never on the enchanted mirror. And that, dear viewers, wraps up part 3 of Bridal Balderdash. From haunted rings to bewitched belts, from chicken curses to magical mirrors, these superstitions proved that our ancestors were terrified of every tiny mishap, always ready to transform a wedding ritual into a full-blown supernatural crisis. Stay tuned for part 4, where we'll explore the hair-raising mirror of matrimonial truth, the chaos of cursed congratulations, and the bizarre antidotes couples use to break their own superstitions. Because sometimes the only way to survive history's absurdity was to laugh in its face. Imagine you've survived feathered bouquets, bewitched belts, and puddings possessed by poltergeists, only to face the mirror of matrimonial truth, a cursed glass that reveals every petty flaw and hidden grudge between you and your spouse. Welcome to Bridal Balderdash Part 4, where we confront the final hair-raising superstitions that turned weddings into epic battles of nerves, curses, and desperate rituals of redemption. The mirror of matrimonial truth stood at the center of many late medieval nuptial chambers. Carved from Venetian glass and hung by silver chains, it was first introduced by Venetian courtiers, who believed reflections could trap the soul. Once the bride and groom exchanged vows, they were required to gaze into this mirror in utter silence. Legend held that the mirror would cloud over to show every unspoken resentment, the groom's flicker of impatience when the bride mispronounced his family name, the bride's suppressed sigh at his frugal dowry negotiations, even the subtle twitch of an eyebrow when a neighbor's toast clanged too loudly. If both parties stared without blinking until the mirror cleared, sometimes for hours, they were deemed pure of marital deceit. Failure to endure the vigil meant calling in a mirror keeper, a witch doctor specializing in reflection curses, who would trace arcane runes around the glass and recombobulate any broken trust with a chant lasting 9 days and nights. Next, the cursed congratulations tradition. After the guests had toasted the couple, they lined up to offer gifts, some sweet, some practical, and some downright diabolical. In 17th century Bavaria, a well-wisher once presented the bride with a pair of embroidered gloves that, according to village gossip, had been worn by a jilted mistress. The bride, oblivious, donned the gloves during the first dance. By midnight, she found her hands perpetually cold and numb, convinced every handshake would sap her joy. To lift the curse, the bride's sister had to host a counter-ritual. Torchlit at dawn, she dunked the gloves in a stream while reciting an old rhyme about washing away envy. Only then did warmth return, along with a newfound distrust of unsolicited wedding presents. Then comes the ring swap ruse. In some alpine villages, superstition decreed that the wedding rings must be swapped 3 times among the couple and their 3 closest kin, parents or siblings, to confuse malicious spirits who might try to steal the marriage bond. Each swap came with a whispered incantation. By blood and by ring I bind you to me. Naturally, this devolved into farce, with ring bearers chasing one another around the bedposts at odd hours, brandishing tiny iron bells to scare off demons. More than one overtaxed in-law swore off weddings forever after accidentally lodging the bride's ring inside a chamber pot, prompting a frantic midnight excavation under candlelight. Perhaps the most harrowing is the dance of the withering flowers. Brides in rural France plaited their bouquets with live blossoms soaked overnight in sacred well water. During the reception, they and the groom performed a slow circle dance around a maypole, each revolution representing a year of marriage, but the bouquet was never allowed to wilt. If any petal fell prematurely, villagers said the marriage's vitality would fade just as quickly. To prevent floral collapse, brides carried hidden vials of rose petal syrup to mist the bouquet discreetly, and grooms bribed nearby children to fan the dance floor with fresh fern fronds. One 16th century bride is recorded as having smuggled her bouquet into the privy for sudden misting, earning her the legend of the lady who danced through septic fumes, yet preserved marital bloom for decades. No superstition was as universally dreaded as the omen ostrich ceremony. In parts of Sicily, newlyweds were marched to a nearby farm where a tame ostrich awaited them. The bird's behavior determined their future. A calm ostrich signaled harmony, a spooked ostrich signaled infidelity or betrayal. Couples had to approach on foot, hand in hand, offering grain from a shared satchel. Should the ostrich peck at one spouse's hand more than the others, villagers interpreted it as a sign that one partner would dominate the union. Interpretations varied wildly, and many couples paid local ostrich readers to stage the outcome, sometimes tying delicate paints to the bird's beak to nudge it toward the desired hand. Then there's the coffer of confessions. In late Renaissance England, couples presented their marriage contract to a locked coffer sealed with wax stamps. Before locking it, each spouse secretly placed a small parchment inside, confessing a single future foible they predicted. I may grumble at dawn, or I fear I will lose keys thrice weekly. After 3 years of wedded life, the coffer was opened, before the parish priest and witnesses. Those who had unwittingly fulfilled their confessed foibles, no matter how trivial, were required to publicly apologize and host a communal feast to break guilt's hold. One famously contrite husband confessed tardiness at meals and was inducted into the local guild of punctuality, fined a barrel of ale each month until his 3rd anniversary. For those desperate to avert curses, the practice of mirror breaking emerged. If a couple feared their mirror of truth had shown too many flaws, they could ceremonially smash it, preferably under a full moon. The shards were then buried at 4 crossroads to confuse vengeful spirits. Yet the act carried its own risks. Broken mirrors were said to curse the home with leaks, fleeting drips from thatched roofs, trickles beneath doors, and only a donation of 7 coins to the poor could staunch the damp and the bad luck. Perhaps the ne plus ultra of superstitions was the ceremony of the unseen witness. In parts of rural Poland, couples signed their marriage banns on a scroll containing a hidden space where an unseen witness, a chosen animal, most often a sparrow, could leave a single feather. Legend claimed that as long as the sparrow watched the signing, the marriage would be protected from secret plots. Bridal parties would station a caged sparrow or small bird on the signing table. Should the bird refuse to perch or drop its feather, the banns had to be reissued and the entire ceremony repeated, often a year later, pending avian cooperation. Some couples circumvented this by bribing a second sparrow to flutter across the table, effectively hiring professional witnesses. Finally, there was the day after déjà vu. In many Germanic regions, it was believed that the second day of marriage was when curses laid on the wedding day would manifest. To protect against this, couples performed the déjà vu blessing on the eve of their wedding day. They repeated the entire ceremony in reverse order before midnight, walking out of the chapel, untying the knot, and whispering their vows backwards. This topsy-turvy ritual supposedly tricked malevolent forces into undoing themselves. Houses would echo with gibberish recitations, and private chapels saw brides giggling through reverse processions, all to ensure that any curses cast would be nullified before sunrise. These superstitions, absurd as they seem now, reveal the medieval psyche's fear that control over tiny moments could safeguard a lifetime. From cursed mirrors to ostrich oracles, from ring-swapping chaos to floral vigilance, our ancestors treated weddings as battlegrounds of cosmic forces. They armed themselves with rituals, charms, and ceremonies, each more outlandish than the last, to outwit fate, jealousy, and the specter of marital disaster. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: when life seems ruled by randomness, we devise elaborate games to feel the illusion of mastery. So there you have it, part 4 of our sardonic journey through wedding superstitions that people actually believed. May your own ceremonies be free of haunted puddings, smear-painted ostriches, and cursed mirrors. And if you ever find yourself reverse walking out of a church at midnight, remember, sometimes the best protection is a good laugh at the absurdity of it all.